Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. A few years ago, I went through what I can only describe as the darkest period of my life. I know that gets thrown around a lot. People say I was depressed, or I was in a bad place, like it's just something to fill space in a conversation. But this was different. It wasn't just a rough patch. It felt like something had taken the light out of everything. I had no energy, no drive, no belief in the future. I barely talked. Even when I was around people, I felt completely disconnected, like I was watching the world from inside a thick, soundproof glass box. And nothing, not music, not food, not people, seemed to reach me anymore. I couldn't laugh. I couldn't even really cry. I just sort of existed. At the time, I was staying with my girlfriend a lot. She was a student living in a dorm on campus, and even though I wasn't enrolled anymore, she let me sleep there most nights. Her room was this small, generic college dorm room. 2 bunks, a desk, the same gray-tiled floors you'd find in any other institutional building. Her roommate was gone that semester, which made it easier. I'd climb up to her bunk at night and just lie there, mostly quiet, sometimes not sleeping until long after she had. She didn't say much about how I was doing, probably because I didn't say much either. I think I scared her a little. I scared myself. One night, sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up feeling like I had to piss. Nothing unusual there. It happens, you get up, stumble your way across the cold floor, and make your way to the shared dorm bathroom down the hall. I remember that specific feeling of needing to stretch after sleeping in a cramped position. I'd been curled into myself near the edge of the mattress. I rolled over and dropped my legs down off the side, then slid off the bunk. The floor was cold under my bare feet, like it always was in that room. My hoodie was in a pile on the desk chair. I picked it up and slipped it on without thinking, arms going through the sleeves automatically. The room was pitch black except for a sliver of orange glow from the parking lot lights peeking through the curtain. I walked to the door. I wasn't fully awake, but I wasn't really groggy either. Just sort of neutral. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want to wake her up. I reached for the door handle, paused for a second, and I don't know why I thought it, but I did. I remember standing there and thinking, I wonder if there's a ghost nearby. Just that. Casual. Random. Not with fear or anxiety, or even curiosity. Just a passing thought, like wondering what time it is, or remembering that you forgot to do the laundry. There was no reason for it. No dream leading up to that moment that I could remember. Nothing on TV or in conversation from earlier that day to plant the idea. But as soon as I had the thought, everything changed. I didn't open the door. Instead, I felt this shift. In the room. In the air around me. I don't know how to explain it in a way that doesn't sound like every cheesy ghost movie ever made, but I swear to you, this was real. Or at least, it felt real in a way I can't overstate. Suddenly, I couldn't move. I wasn't paralyzed in the way people talk about sleep paralysis, where your body is locked in place, but you're conscious. This was different. I wasn't lying in bed. I was upright, standing by the door, eyes open, fully lucid, and my entire body was just frozen. And then I felt it. Something pulled me. I didn't see anything. I wasn't grabbed. But I felt this pressure, cold, heavy, precise, against my chest, and I was being lifted. Not physically picked up by someone, but yanked upward by an invisible force. My feet left the floor. My arms were rigid at my sides. My spine bent back so sharply it felt like my ribs were going to snap open from the inside. I had never felt anything like it before in my life. I had no control. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't panicking. It was like my brain was stunned silent by the shock of what was happening. And then came the burning. My eyes slammed shut on their own, but not because of fear or reflex. It felt like something had branded the insides of my eyelids. I don't know how else to say that. I saw the shapes of crosses, like hot metal had been pushed into my closed eyes. I couldn't see them in the room. I couldn't touch them, but they were there. These clear, burning symbols. It didn't make any sense. Nothing did. And then the laughter started. I'm not even sure I want to write it out. It sounds ridiculous. I know how it sounds. The way it echoed, it didn't come from behind me or in front of me or from outside. It came from everywhere at once. And it wasn't laughter like a person. It was like a mocking chorus of something that had never been human, like it was laughing at me, not with me, and not even for its own amusement, just to hurt me. It went on, louder and louder. I remember it rising in pitch, almost like it was spiraling up a drain. Mwahaha ha. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. My body was locked in place. My chest was tight, but not like I was suffocating, like my ribs were being pulled open by wires. I felt like I was being fed into something, like I wasn't in a room anymore, but on the edge of falling into something I didn't understand and didn't want to. And then it stopped. Not like a snap. Not like waking up from a regular dream where everything disappears all at once and you're just back in your body. This was different. I didn't wake up so much as fade back into the room. It was like the whole experience, the floating, the pressure, the burning, the laughter, just parted in front of me like fog lifting, and there I was again, lying in the bunk, in the dark, next to my girlfriend. I didn't sit up. I didn't move at all. I just stared at the ceiling in silence. My heart wasn't pounding. I wasn't soaked in sweat. There was no typical nightmare reaction. It was more like I had come back from something. I had been somewhere else, and now I was back in my body. I lay there frozen, confused, empty. Then, out of nowhere, I started crying. Not loud sobbing. No gasping. Just silent, steady tears. My chest hurt. My throat ached, but I wasn't making a sound. I couldn't explain why I was crying. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It wasn't even sadness. It was like a leak had opened up inside me, and something was pouring out. 10 seconds, maybe 15. And then it stopped just like that. I didn't tell my girlfriend about it. I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I had a dream where I got lifted into the air by some evil force that burned crosses into my eyes and laughed like a cartoon demon. Who wouldn't roll their eyes at that? It sounds like a made-up story you'd find on a forum where people post about Ouija boards and ghost sightings. But I swear on everything that it didn't feel like a dream. Not even a little bit. It felt like something reached in and pulled me out of the world for a moment. I wasn't asleep in any normal way. I was somewhere else. And here's the weirdest part. That morning, I felt lighter. I'm not saying the depression vanished. It didn't. I still had a long way to go. But something shifted. I didn't feel so weighed down. I could take a deeper breath. I got up earlier than usual, took a shower, and even walked to a coffee shop to sit and write in a notebook. Nothing profound. Just thoughts. But I hadn't done that in months. It was like something had ripped through me in the night and left behind an opening, some kind of exit wound. I know what you're thinking. Okay, so it was just a dream. And maybe it was. Maybe it was just my brain processing things, combining imagery and feelings and fears into something intense and hallucinatory. People have terrifying dreams all the time, especially when they're in deep emotional distress. That's what any psychiatrist or neuroscientist would say. But the thing is, even knowing that, even understanding how dreams work and how the brain protects itself and creates narratives when we're overwhelmed, I still can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a dream. I've had thousands of dreams in my life, some strange, some vivid, but never like that. Never so complete. Never so real that I forgot what waking was supposed to feel like. I don't think it was a ghost. I don't think it was a demon. I'm not trying to sell you on any spiritual ideas or horror movie cliches. I don't even believe in that stuff, not really. I think what happened was something my mind created. Yes, but created from something very deep. Something primal. Something that had been buried in me for a long time and needed to force its way out. It was like a warning, or a purge. When you're that far gone, when you're stuck in a place where nothing reaches you anymore, sometimes your brain doesn't whisper. It screams. It breaks through in the only language it has left. And that night it chose fear. Real, raw, archetypal fear. The kind of fear that wakes something up inside you, even if just a little. I didn't change overnight. I didn't become happy. But I remembered what it felt like to feel something again, even if that something was terror. And in a strange way, that was the beginning of climbing out. Not fast, not smooth, but it started there. And I've never had another dream like it since. I don't really know where to begin. It's hard to explain what happened in that house. All I can do now is look back and wonder if it was all just my imagination, or if it was something else. But no matter how hard I try to convince myself it was just in my head, I know what I felt, and I know what I saw. We had moved around a lot when I was younger. My mom, my brother, and I were used to never staying in one place for too long. Moving from town to town, from apartment to apartment, it was a constant cycle. But when I was 14, we moved into this house in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. It seemed fine at first. Just another house in another town. A 2-story place with old wooden floors, high ceilings, and lots of rooms. It had a kind of charm to it, but there was something off about it too. We didn't know it at the time, but that house was going to haunt us in ways I can't even explain. I remember one night, about a week after we moved in. It was about an hour before my usual bedtime, and I decided to take a shower. I didn't think anything of it. It was just part of my routine. I walked into the bathroom, flipped the light switch, and reached over to turn the shower knob. But before I even touched it, the water came on. It wasn't gradual. It was like someone had already turned it on before I even got there. The sound of the water hitting the tub was so sudden that it made me jump. I pulled my hand back quickly, staring at the knob, and it just stayed on. There was no one in the bathroom with me. No reason for it to turn on like that. I didn't know what to do. I stood there for a second, just staring at the water running, and then without thinking, I bolted out of there. I couldn't get out of that bathroom fast enough. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my whole body felt cold. I didn't even take the shower after that. I went straight to my room, pulled the covers over my head, and tried to convince myself that I had imagined it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that house. Things didn't get any better after that. It felt like every night was filled with something strange, something I couldn't explain. I remember waking up one night, the room pitch dark except for the faint light coming through the window. I heard footsteps. It sounded like someone was walking up the stairs, slow but steady, as if they were making their way toward my room. My heart started pounding again, but this time it wasn't just fear, it was dread. The kind of feeling that makes your stomach drop, like you know something is about to happen, but you can't stop it. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the sound kept getting closer. The footsteps were clear now, and they were coming up the stairs. I could hear them so clearly that I could almost count the steps. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I turned my head slowly toward the hallway, and that's when I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't just a shadow of someone walking up the stairs. It was something else. It was dark, too dark to be a normal shadow, and it seemed to be growing as it came closer. It didn't have a shape that made sense, not like a normal person's shadow would. It was just this black, shifting mass, and it seemed to be getting closer and closer until it filled the whole hallway. My heart was in my throat, and I was frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I just stared at it, waiting for whatever was going to happen. But then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I turned away quickly, not daring to look back. I shut my eyes tightly and tried to force myself to fall back asleep, but the feeling of dread didn't go away. It lingered in the air like something was watching me. I didn't sleep much that night. That was just one of many things that happened while we lived in that house. As the days went by, more strange things started happening. It wasn't just me. My brother had his own experiences too. Sometimes, I would hear him yelling in the middle of the night, his voice shaking with fear. When I asked him what was going on, he'd tell me about things he saw in his room. Shadows moving across the walls. Strange noises in the middle of the night. It was like the house was alive, and it didn't want us there. It got so bad that my mom started doing research, looking for answers. She read somewhere that cats were supposed to act as protectors against bad spirits, so she decided to get a few. We went to the shelter and picked out a couple of cats, thinking they might help. But the cats hated that house just as much as we did. It was like they knew something was wrong. They would stare at nothing, hissing at empty spaces in the air, their eyes wide and filled with fear. There were times when they would crouch down, ready to attack something invisible. It was unnerving to watch. Sometimes, they would dart across the room as if something had just brushed past them. Other times, they'd hiss and run for cover, their fur standing on end, like they were trying to get away from something none of us could see. After a month or so, my mom decided to get a few more cats, thinking maybe they'd help with whatever was going on. But it didn't make a difference. It was like the house was feeding on our fear, growing stronger with every night we spent there. We could never shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was like there was always something in the house, something watching us. It wasn't just the shadows or the strange noises. It was the overwhelming sense of being followed, of being in a place where we didn't belong. At one point, Things got so bad that my mom, my brother, and I all ended up in the same room together. We couldn't stand being in our own rooms anymore. The fear was too much to handle alone, so we stuck together. We would pile into my older brother's room and lock the door, hoping that maybe, just maybe, we would feel safe there. But even then, it never stopped. We could still hear things moving in the dark. We could still feel the weight of something else in the room with us. One of the worst things that happened was when I woke up in the middle of the night, the house silent and still. I thought it was just another restless night, but when I opened my eyes, I saw something in the corner of my room. It was a figure, just standing there, staring at me. I couldn't make out any details, just the dark silhouette of a person, watching from the corner. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just kept my eyes locked on it, waiting for it to do something. But it didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. After what felt like forever, I finally managed to close my eyes and fall back asleep. When I woke up the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Like the air had changed overnight, or like something had shifted in the house while I slept. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. I didn't think anyone would believe me. But that wasn't the only time it happened. There were other nights, other times when I woke up to find someone, or something, standing at the edge of my bed, just watching. After we moved out of that house, I thought maybe the fear would go away, that we would leave it all behind. But it didn't. The memories stayed with me. The feeling of dread, the shadows that seemed to follow me, the unshakable sense of being watched. I still don't know what happened in that house, but I know I'll never forget it. To this day, I can't explain what went on in that place. Maybe it was just a bad coincidence, or maybe it was something else entirely. I'll never know. But the fear I felt in that house, the terror that seemed to linger in the air, it's something I'll never forget. And every time I think back on those nights, I can't help but feel like something, whatever it was, is still out there waiting. I worked as a light board operator at my high school theater, and for the most part, it was a pretty standard job. The kind of thing where you're just behind the scenes, setting up lights, making sure cues run smoothly, and no one really notices you unless something goes wrong. And being the shy, introverted type, that suited me just fine. But what wasn't so fine was the fact that our theater had a reputation for being haunted. Every year, new kids would hear the stories about the ghost of a lighting student who had died years ago. Some said he fell from the catwalk while working on lights. Others claimed it was a tragic accident. But the one that stuck was that he had died from cancer after working in that theater for years. I didn't buy it. I mean, ghosts? Really? The whole thing just seemed like a way for lighting students to dodge blame when something went wrong with the lights. Still, I respected the tradition. Every time I passed the small plaque for the student, I'd give a half-hearted thanks, like we were supposed to. It didn't feel real to me, but I did it anyway. Freshman year was when I was first given the chance to run the light board for a show. It was a huge deal, something I'd been working towards since I joined the theater club. I had spent hours practicing, making sure I knew every cue and every button, and even though I was nervous, I felt pretty ready. The stage manager, Derek, was an experienced guy and assured me everything would be fine. He even offered to handle the cues for me, just to take some of the pressure off. The first night of the show went fine. I was shaky, but nothing had gone wrong. The lights were running on time, the actors were performing well, and the audience was engaged. It was easy to forget about the ghosts and the history of the place. But then, on the second night, things started to feel off. I was sitting in the booth, focusing on the screen in front of me, watching the lights flicker on and off with each cue. Derek was in his usual spot beside me, making sure everything was in order. About halfway through the show, I started to feel this weird unease, like I was being watched. I didn't say anything at first, chalking it up to nerves, but when Derek started to scowl, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I asked him what was wrong, but he didn't answer right away. He just stared at the stage, the frown deepening. After a moment, he finally said it. The spotlight operators were freaking out. They'd been reporting strange noises coming from the catwalk. We were used to some noises. Old buildings make sounds, but this was different. The spot operators were convinced there was someone up there with them, someone they hadn't seen go up. Now, our auditorium had a pretty simple setup. The only way to reach the catwalk, where the spotlights were stationed, was through a narrow closet, which was locked every night. There was no way anyone could get up there without us knowing. But still, the idea of someone up there made everyone uneasy. What if it was someone trying to break in? Or worse, someone who had no business being there? I could see the tension mounting as the spot operators kept looking around nervously, and one of them, Jake, decided to go up and investigate. He grabbed his flashlight and headed towards the small ladder that led to the catwalk. It wasn't long before he was up there, but after a few minutes, no one had heard from him. Derek checked the comm system. It was working fine. He tried texting Jake. Nothing. At this point, we were starting to panic. We couldn't just sit there and pretend like everything was fine. So, Derek told me to stay put and sent our director up to check on the situation. I watched the time tick by as the minutes passed. It felt like hours. 5 minutes later, Derek's face was even more worried than before. The director hadn't come back. Derek didn't hesitate. He grabbed the sound guy, Tim, and told him to go up there next. Tim wasn't due for his next cue for another 20 minutes, so he was free to go. Another 5 minutes. Then another. No one had returned. It wasn't like anyone was just going to forget about it. Jake, the director, and Tim were all seasoned theater people. They wouldn't just disappear without explanation. Something was wrong. And then it happened. The noise. It came out of nowhere, loud and sharp, like metal striking metal, echoing through the whole theater. It wasn't a small noise either. It was a crash, something heavy and violent, like the entire catwalk had been struck by something massive. The sound reverberated through the building, sending chills down my spine. I immediately stood up, staring at the source of the noise, which was still coming from the catwalk. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't make sense. There was no way anyone could have made that sound unless something was up there. Derek was standing beside me, looking just as terrified. The whole booth felt like it was vibrating with anxiety. Below us, the actors on stage froze, looking up in confusion. The audience murmured nervously, and I could see some of them shifting in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing a malfunction or something worse. For a moment, everything went still, but the sound didn't stop. It came again, like a giant hammer smashing against metal, deafening and completely unexplainable. We all stared at the catwalk, willing the noise to stop. It felt like it would never end, but after what felt like an eternity, it did. Everything went silent again. No more crashing, no more banging. Just silence. The room felt like it was holding its breath. And then, just as quickly as the noise had started, the spotlight operators returned to their posts. They seemed completely unaware of what had just happened. They went about their work as if nothing had changed. The director came back down the ladder too, looking just as confused as the others. Tim came in right after him, completely calm. It was as if they hadn't heard a thing. But we knew. We had all heard it. We were all on edge, exchanging confused looks, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Derek was the first to speak. It was probably the heating system. The school's cheap. They don't run the heat after hours, so maybe it was just the pipes expanding or contracting. It's old. It happens. We all nodded, but none of us really believed it. The heating system might make a noise, but nothing like that. That was the sound of something, or someone, slamming into the catwalk. It didn't make sense. The rest of the show went on, but the tension was palpable. I couldn't focus on my cues anymore. My mind kept drifting back to what had happened. What was that noise? Why had no one else heard it? And why had those 3 people disappeared without a word? It didn't add up. The next day, I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a weird sound, and we were all on edge for some reason. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. The others in the booth that night, the ones who had been there with me, felt the same way. We all knew something had happened that couldn't be explained. It was too real, too terrifying. Something about that sound felt like it came from somewhere deep in the building, from somewhere we weren't meant to hear. To this day, no one knows what caused that noise. Derek still insists it was the heating system, though I can't see how that makes sense. The school didn't run the heat that late in the spring, and even if it had, that noise was too intense to be anything as mundane as pipes shifting. Was it just some strange coincidence? Or did something else happen that night? I'll never be able to say for sure, but the others and I are convinced it was the ghost. Maybe not in the way people usually think of ghosts, but there was something there. Something we couldn't explain. I still work in the theater, and every time I walk past the plaque dedicated to the student who died, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine. I make sure to thank him now, though, just in case. We arrived at Six Flags, Hurricane Harbor, just after the gates opened. It was a perfect day for a water park, clear skies, warm air, and the excitement of a new adventure. It was just my son and me, a rare chance for a quality family vacation. He was practically bouncing with excitement, talking non-stop about all the rides he couldn't wait to go on. I smiled, trying to match his enthusiasm, but honestly, I was dreading the crowds and the chaos. I wasn't much for big slides. I'd rather float around in the lazy river, or maybe ride the smaller slides where you sit on a mat and coast down. But for him, this was the trip of a lifetime, so I promised I'd stick with him as much as I could. The park was already filling up with people, but it was still manageable. We wandered through the entrance, and he immediately pulled me toward the back of the park, where the giant water slides loomed in the distance. I knew these were the big ones, the ones that spiraled down from heights that made my stomach drop just thinking about it. But my son was practically vibrating with excitement, his eyes wide as he tugged me forward. "I want to ride those," he said, pointing toward the massive slides at the back of the park. I could hear the rush of water and the screams of people plummeting down from high up. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel my stomach twist. I wasn't sure I was ready to watch him take those on, but I also knew how much he wanted it. We began to walk toward the slides, and I couldn't help but notice how crowded it was getting. The closer we got, the more the sea of people seemed to grow, pressing in from all sides. The line for the slides stretched up the stairs like an endless serpent, winding up to the top of the platform, which seemed miles away from where we stood. I could feel a wave of anxiety start to wash over me as we approached. The stairs themselves were a sight to behold, narrow, steep, and packed. They were several stories high, but the only thing separating the hundreds of people from falling off the edge was a flimsy little handrail. The sight of so many bodies packed so tightly together made me uneasy. I knew I had to let go and let him do this on his own, but that feeling of panic kept rising. It wasn't just the height, or the chaos, or the water. It was the sense of how easy it would be for something to go wrong. He was barely taller than the people around him, but that didn't stop him from pushing forward, eager to get in line. He darted off to join the other kids, his little figure swallowed up by the crowd. I stayed behind, watching, trying to keep him in my line of sight. As the minutes passed, the line didn't seem to move. It was like everyone was stuck, shuffling forward inch by inch. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that this was his moment, and he was so capable. But every time he disappeared around a bend, or I lost sight of him for a second, my heart would start to race. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I saw him. He was halfway up the stairs, looking small but determined as he climbed. The stairs creaked under the weight of the people around him, and I could see the sway of the rail with each step. I gripped the metal rail at the base of the stairs, staring up, watching him inch his way up higher. The handrail was barely more than a suggestion for safety. The distance between the steps and the rail felt so open, so dangerous. What if he tripped? What if someone else tripped and fell into him? My mind was spiraling. I tried to push the panic out of my mind, focusing on the steady rhythm of his climb. But as he got higher, the more my worry deepened. I tried not to imagine him losing his footing, or something worse. My eyes stayed glued to him, watching as he reached the top. I couldn't see anything beyond the platform, but I knew that once he made it, I'd be able to breathe again. He would be okay. It didn't work that way. The minute he disappeared behind the platform, I couldn't see him anymore. I could hear the laughter and screams of people coming down the slides, the rush of water cascading over them. But I couldn't see him. The panic started to rise again. Minutes passed. My eyes darted back and forth, scanning the top of the slide, but I couldn't see him. Every person who came down the slide seemed to take forever. Where was he? Did he get stuck? Was he okay? I started to panic, not knowing if I missed him somehow, if he couldn't find me, if he was already down and in the pool but I missed him. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. What if something happened? What if he couldn't get on the slide? What if he was stuck up there, waiting for help? I looked back at the crowd, trying to find someone who could help. But everyone seemed oblivious, having a good time. I had to stay calm, I told myself. He was fine. He could handle this. Everything would be fine. He'd be down soon. But then, just as I was starting to feel like maybe I was just overreacting, something caught my eye. A blur of motion. I could see a body coming down the slide, falling fast, slipping down through the water with surprising speed. For a moment, I couldn't quite register what I was seeing. And then it hit me, the blonde hair. It was him. It was my son, tumbling down safe and making it to the pool. Relief flooded me. He was fine. He'd done it. I watched him splash into the water and float there, taking a moment to catch his breath. He was safe. Everything was okay. But then, just as quickly, the feeling of unease crept back. I couldn't see him anymore. My heart thudded in my chest as I scanned the water, looking for his head. The lifeguards were already in motion. A sense of dread gripped me. Something was wrong. I pushed through the crowd, moving as quickly as I could, but the people around me seemed to be moving in slow motion. There were so many of them, all standing still, staring at the scene unfolding before us. The lifeguard had jumped into the water, his arms moving quickly as he reached for something, or someone. I shoved past a group of people, my heart racing. "Excuse me," I called, my voice tight with panic. "That's my son." My feet felt like they were stuck in the thick mud of the crowd, but I kept pushing forward, determined to reach him. My eyes never left the pool. I could see him. I could see his face now, pale and unmoving. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what was happening. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. He was floating, his body stiff, like a rag doll. The lifeguard was trying to revive him. I could hear the distant, frantic sounds of people trying to help. My legs were shaking, but I kept moving, pushing against the weight of the crowd. I didn't care if I was yelling or shoving people out of my way. I had to get to him. Then I heard something. "Mom." It was so faint at first, I almost didn't recognize the voice. I stumbled to a halt, the words echoing in my ears. "Mom." The voice came again, louder this time. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, and there he was. My son, standing right in front of me. I looked down at him, his blonde hair wet and plastered to his forehead. His eyes were wide with confusion, his face pale, but he was perfectly fine. He was alive. He was standing there, tugging at my shoulder. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked. I was frozen. I couldn't speak. The realization hit me hard. That child I had seen in the pool, the one I thought was my son, wasn't him. It was someone else. Someone who had looked just like him. Someone with the same blonde hair. I turned back to the lifeguard and the commotion in the pool. The lifeguard was pulling the other child from the water, performing CPR, trying to revive him. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from my son, standing right next to me, completely safe. I hadn't even realized I was shaking until my son wrapped his arms around me, his wet clothes pressing against my skin. "Honey, I thought that was you. I thought you were dead," I whispered. But he didn't understand. He didn't know what had happened, what I had just been through. The other child was revived, and the paramedics soon arrived, rushing to the scene. But I couldn't look away from my son, standing there with me, alive, safe. The whole experience felt surreal, like I had just lived through a nightmare and woken up, but nothing made sense. I held him tighter, the relief still settling in my chest, trying to quiet the frantic thoughts in my head. The lifeguards and staff handled the rest. The ambulance took the other child away, but for me, my world had shifted. The fear that had consumed me just moments before seemed impossible now. My son was right here, safe. It happened in the fall, sometime around October or early November. My mom was 14, the oldest of 5 kids, and they lived in a small rural community in Alabama. It was the early 1970s, and things were different back then. People raised their kids to be tough, self-reliant. There wasn't always someone to call when something bad happened, and you learned early how to look out for yourself. My grandfather had grown up during hard times and didn't trust the world much, so he wanted to teach his kids how to defend themselves, especially with everything that had been going on in their neighborhood. He wasn't a paranoid man, but he believed in being prepared, and that's why he decided to take the family out to the woods that weekend. There was a patch of land off a dirt road not too far from where they lived. My grandfather had been there before. It was surrounded by tall, skinny trees with their branches mostly bare from the season. The ground was coated in brown and orange leaves, dry and crisp. The kind that crunched loudly under your feet with every step. It was the kind of area where people sometimes dumped trash or old furniture they didn't want anymore. Nobody really went there unless they had a reason. They all piled into the family's old car, my grandmother, my mom, her 3 younger sisters, and her little brother, who was still small enough to need help getting into the back seat. My grandfather kept the rifle in the trunk, wrapped in an old towel. They packed a thermos of coffee and some peanut butter sandwiches, not expecting to be gone long. When they got to the woods, my grandfather parked the car in a small clearing just off the dirt road. There wasn't any path, just a slight opening between the trees where tire tracks had worn down the grass. It was quiet, no other cars, no birds even. Just the sound of the wind moving the dry branches and the crunch of their shoes as they walked deeper into the trees. The air had that sharp smell that comes in autumn, a mix of cold soil, old bark, and something crisp that makes you feel like winter isn't far off. They walked in a ways, far enough that they couldn't see the road anymore. My grandfather found a fallen log to set the rifle on and started showing the older kids how to aim and fire. My mom took her turn, a little unsure at first, but excited to learn. Her sisters were mostly watching, giggling when the gun went off. My grandmother held the baby on her hip, keeping him warm in a thick blanket. It was supposed to be a simple family outing, something to teach the kids, something they'd remember. Then they heard it. It was the sound of a car engine, deep and low, coming from somewhere behind them. Not on the road, not nearby. It was too loud and too close. My mom remembers the way her dad's whole body stiffened. He put a finger to his lips and motioned for everyone to get low. He whispered for them to get under the leaves. Not behind a tree. Not back to the car. He had them scatter and lie down in the brush, quickly covering them with handfuls of dry leaves. My mom said the leaves scratched her face and got into her clothes, but she didn't make a sound. My grandfather kept the rifle in his hands and crouched low too, close enough to see everything but not be seen. They waited like that, still and silent. Then the car came into view. It was an old blue Ford Galaxy, rumbling slowly over the uneven ground. The tires cracked branches as it crept forward into the woods. My mom could see it through the slats between tree trunks, and she remembers the way it didn't seem to be looking for a place to turn around. It was driving like it had a destination. The car stopped about 30 feet from where they were hidden. The driver's door opened, and a man got out. He was tall, with dark hair. He didn't look around much. He just walked to the passenger side, opened that door, and reached inside. Then he pulled out a woman. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She didn't say anything. He dragged her like she weighed nothing, holding her under the arms, her legs trailing in the leaves. She wore a red dress, torn at one shoulder. Her feet were bare. My mom said the skin on her arms looked pale, like she'd been cold for a long time. The man dragged her a few yards away from the car and just dropped her. Then he turned, got back in the Ford, and drove off. No rush, no panic. My grandfather waited until the sound of the engine faded into nothing. Then he stood up, rifle ready. He moved slowly toward the woman. My mom said the moment was like a movie scene. Everyone crawled out from under the leaves, brushing themselves off, leaves stuck in their hair, faces wide with fear. The woman sat up. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She just looked at them, straight-faced, her eyes distant like she wasn't really there. My grandfather asked her if she needed help. She shook her head barely, just enough to say no. She didn't say a word. There wasn't a scratch on her, but something about her wasn't right, like she was empty inside. She looked at them for a few seconds longer, then looked away like they didn't matter anymore. That was enough for my grandfather. He told everyone to head back to the car, quickly and quietly. As they walked back, the forest felt different. The wind had stopped. The woods were still. My mom said every little sound, the crunch of a footstep, the rustle of clothes, felt too loud, like they were being watched. When they reached the dirt road, they weren't expecting to see anyone. But there he was, the blue Ford Galaxy. The man was driving slowly, just a crawl, and heading straight toward them. My grandfather didn't look away. He held the rifle high, not aiming it, just letting the man see it. The car pulled up beside them, and the man rolled down his window. He smiled, said a few things, small talk, asked what they were doing out there. My grandfather said they were just out for some target practice. My mom remembers the way the man's eyes moved from one face to another. Then he looked at the rifle again, smiled once more, and told them to have a good day. On the seat next to him was a machete. Not in a sheath, not hidden, just laying there across the seat like it belonged. The man drove off, slow and steady, and disappeared down the road. My grandfather didn't say a word until they were all back in the car and pulling away. He dropped them off at home and said he needed to go back. Later that day, he returned to the woods alone. The woman was gone. No sign of her anywhere. But he did find a few things. A wig tangled in some leaves. A brown leather purse with nothing inside. A a wad of used Kleenex, a pair of broken eyeglasses. He gathered the items and brought them home, laying them out on the kitchen table like they were clues in a mystery. My mom saw the items and broke down. She screamed and cried, convinced that the man had come back and killed the woman, that she had been dead all along, or worse, too scared to run. My grandfather tried to calm her down, but there wasn't much to say. He took the items to the police the next morning. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The next morning, while my mom was getting her siblings ready for school, the phone rang. She picked it up. It was my grandmother calling from work. Her voice was quiet and urgent. She told my mom not to let the kids go to the bus stop. She said she was leaving work right away and would come home to drive them to school herself. When my mom asked why, my grandmother told her the car was back. The blue Ford Galaxy. It was parked near the bus stop, waiting. That was the last they ever saw of it. My grandfather never found out who the man was, or what really happened to the woman. They never saw her face in the papers. No one came around asking questions. The police didn't follow up. Years passed. The story became something the family didn't talk about anymore. But my mom never forgot. She kept that memory buried for years, only telling me once I was grown, like she'd been holding it inside all that time. Even now, she gets a faraway look when she talks about it, like she's right back there in the leaves, holding her breath, watching a man drop a woman like trash in the woods. And sometimes, when I think about it too long, I wonder what would have happened if they hadn't hidden, if the man had seen them, if my grandfather hadn't brought the rifle, if the woman had screamed, if she'd run. But she didn't, and he came back. I've always dealt with sleep paralysis. From as far back as I can remember, around age 3, it started, and it never really stopped. Most nights were battles. It became a normal part of life, like brushing my teeth or locking the front door. Every single night, without fail, the weight would come down on me, and the shapes would start crawling in from the edges of my vision. I was just a kid back then, but I learned fast. I had to. By the time I was a teenager, I'd started to figure out patterns. I learned that right before things got really bad, before the hallucinations fully set in, my spine would start to tingle. It was subtle at first, just a prickling warmth running up the middle of my back. Then it would deepen, like a warning bell going off inside me. That signal became my way out. I'd force myself awake as soon as I felt it. Most times, I could just barely pull myself out before the full terror kicked in. I'm 22 now. I've learned how to function. I'm at university, have a great girlfriend, a decent part-time job, and for the most part, things are good. I don't talk about this stuff much anymore. There's always been a part of me that feels darker than the rest, something I've tried to keep in check. It's always been there, like a shadow at the edge of who I am. I want to tell you about the night when all of that darkness became real. I was 17, right at the edge of adulthood, and feeling more free than I ever had before. I just earned my second-degree black belt in martial arts. I was doing great in school, confident, healthy, and for the first time in my life, the sleep paralysis had started to ease up. I was getting full nights of sleep, waking up feeling like a normal person. It was like someone had turned off the storm and let the sun shine through. I thought maybe I'd beaten it. Maybe that part of my life was finally behind me. I remember the day clearly. It was a normal day, cold but clear. I'd gone to training after school, grabbed a takeaway on the way home, and spent the evening in my room, revising a bit, then watching videos until it got late. I went to bed like I always did, without any sense of what was coming. No bad feeling. Nothing strange. Just sleep. The dream started soft. I was in a hallway long and white, like a hospital corridor. There were people around me, some familiar, some not, but none of them looked at me. Everyone was quiet. I remember hearing footsteps echoing behind me, far off at first. Then the tingling started in my spine, that same old warning signal. But this time, I couldn't wake up. I tried to jolt myself out of it, tried to blink hard, move my fingers. Nothing worked. The dream held me there. The tingling grew stronger, heavier, like my whole back was on fire. Everyone turned to face the staircase at the end of the hallway. Something was coming up the steps. Slow, dragging steps. With each footfall, the pressure in my chest grew worse. It was hard to breathe. When the figure reached the top of the stairs, I felt my legs give way in the dream. It stood there, still, but somehow radiated hatred. I didn't see a face, just a mass of something wrong. A shadow wrapped around bones. Then it moved. It came at me fast. I felt the pain of it stabbing into me, again and again. I could feel every second of it. Not imagined pain, real, sharp, twisting pain. I died in that dream, slowly. My body burned and my lungs collapsed. It was the worst pain I've ever felt. And then I woke up. But it wasn't the relief that usually came after nightmares. I knew instantly that I was in sleep paralysis. The weight was there on my chest. My arms wouldn't move. My eyes were wide open, but I couldn't scream, couldn't even whisper. The room looked normal, the dim light of the moon spilling through the crack in the curtains. Shadows moved across the ceiling. That was normal, too. Hallucinations. I'd seen it all before. Faces that weren't real, creatures that crawled up the walls and scuttled into corners. I'd trained myself to ignore them. But this time, one thing was different. One figure didn't move. He stood at the foot of my bed. Tall, thin, arms too long. His face wasn't some vague shadow. This one had definition. He had eyes, and they were locked on mine. Bulging, glassy eyes. His skin was pale, like paper left in the sun too long. His mouth wasn't twisted into a snarl or smile, just a flat, hateful line. His entire presence reeked of malice. And the longer I stared, the more I realized something I hadn't before. He wasn't fading. He wasn't twitching or glitching out like the others. He wasn't a hallucination. My heart pounded. I tried to move again. Nothing. I focused on breathing, tried to make myself wake up for real, but he just stood there, staring. Then he lifted his hand. Slowly. Something in his grip caught the moonlight, a knife. A long, sharp knife. The reflection flickered across my wall. I couldn't look away. He raised it above his head, eyes still boring into mine, and then he brought it down. I saw the motion. I felt the pain explode in my leg, deep and hot. And then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed. My mouth was dry, and there was a bandage wrapped tight around my leg. I couldn't move properly. I looked around, still half in a daze, and then I heard my dad's voice nearby. He was talking to a nurse, his voice strained. He only sounds like that when something's gone really wrong. I didn't understand it at first. I thought maybe it was just another dream. It had to be, right? The pain was still there in my leg, though, and the smells, the sharp disinfectant, the rubber of medical gloves, those were real. Slowly, I pieced it together. The man from my dream had been real. He wasn't some hallucination conjured by my mind. He was flesh and blood, and he'd broken into our house. Later, I found out that he was someone my mom had known years ago, a man with serious mental issues. He'd been in and out of facilities. There had been signs, apparently. He'd attacked another child a few years earlier, but vanished before anyone could bring him in. Somehow, he'd found his way to us, found his way into my room, and he had a knife. My dad had been the one to stop him. He heard a noise from my room, came in, and saw the man over me, knife in hand. He tackled him, fought him off, and managed to get the blade away. He called the police while holding the guy down with a broken chair leg. If he'd come in even a few seconds later, it could have been so much worse. I could have bled out. I might not even be here to tell you this. The scar on my leg is still there. A thin, jagged line that runs along my thigh. A reminder. I didn't dream it. It wasn't my mind playing tricks. That night, my worst fear came true. Something came through the gap between dreams and reality, and it was real. I still deal with sleep paralysis, even now, but everything's different since then. I don't trust what I see in those moments anymore. I used to tell myself it wasn't real, that it couldn't hurt me, but now I know better. Now I sleep with a bat by my bed. I check every window and lock twice. I never sleep with my back to the room. And sometimes, when I'm lying there, half awake and frozen, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up in time, if my dad hadn't been there. People like to dismiss sleep paralysis. They call it night terrors or bad dreams. But if you've lived with it like I have, every night for years, you start to understand that not all of it is just in your head. Sometimes the things that come in the dark are real. Sometimes they find a way through. I've moved on in most ways. I live in a better place now. I'm about to graduate. I have good people around me. I laugh, I go out, I study, I love. But I'll never forget that night. Never stop checking the shadows. And no matter how safe my life seems, I know that somewhere out there are still people like him. People who lurk just outside the boundaries of normal life. People who wait for the moment when you're most vulnerable. I don't sleep as deeply anymore, but I sleep alive. And that's enough. It was just another night at the late shift at the restaurant. We closed at midnight, so the last hour or so was always spent cleaning up, wiping down the counters, scrubbing the grills, and making sure everything was in place for the next day. The place was usually pretty quiet by then. Most of the customers had cleared out, and we'd finish up our tasks in silence, waiting for the clock to hit 12 so we could lock the doors and go home. On that particular night, everything was going as usual. The restaurant was nearly spotless, the last of the fryers shut off, and the smell of cooked food was starting to dissipate. My co-workers and I were moving around the back of the kitchen, sweeping the floors and putting away the cleaning supplies. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed lightly in the otherwise still space. Then, I noticed something through the window. It was just a car pulling into the parking lot, headlights shining through the glass, cutting through the darkness of the late hour. I didn't think anything of it at first. People often tried to sneak in after close, hoping we'd still be open. It was almost like a game to them. They'd see if they could catch us before we locked the door. We'd had people come up to the door in the past, tap the glass, realize we were closed, and shuffle off without much fuss. It was typical, so I didn't even stop sweeping to look closer at the car. But this one was different. It was a Cadillac Escalade, black, sleek, and with heavily tinted windows. A car that looked way too expensive for this late-night chain. It wasn't the sort of car you'd expect to see rolling into a place like ours. As it came to a stop, I saw the figure inside. A big dude, tall and broad, in a shiny, old-school 90s style sweatsuit. The kind that looked like it was straight out of a music video from that era. I couldn't help but stare for a second, trying to make sense of it. He stepped out of the car, and my first thought was, that's a Biggie Smalls lookalike. It wasn't that he exactly looked like Biggie Smalls, but he had that same heavy-set build, the same confident swagger, the kind of presence that made you pause. He was dressed in a dark, oversized sweatsuit that matched the vibe perfectly. I figured it was just some guy who was probably a little too late for dinner. I casually waved from inside, pointing at the closed sign on the door. I wasn't trying to be rude, but I figured if I made it clear we were closed, he'd just turn around and leave. Most people do. But this guy, he wasn't like most people. When I pointed at the sign, I saw the look in his eyes change. His face twisted into something I didn't expect, pure anger. I could see him clenching his fists, his jaw tightening. Without warning, he started stomping his feet like he was about to throw a tantrum. It was so sudden and violent that I took a step back, a little shocked. I didn't know if he was just having a bad night or if something else was going on. And then it got worse. I watched as he turned, slammed his fist into the side of his car like a child throwing a fit. It was a stupid move. I could see the dent in the car door from where I stood. I had a feeling this guy didn't care much about his own property, but it made me nervous. He wasn't acting like a regular customer who just didn't understand that we were closed. This guy was way too angry for that. His friend, the guy who had been sitting quietly in the passenger seat, got out of the car too. He was trying to calm Biggie Smalls' lookalike down, saying something, trying to get him to stop being so loud and aggressive. But instead of listening, Biggie Smalls' lookalike turned on him. I could see the moment his fist connected with the guy's face. It was fast. Too fast. 1 second, they were talking, the next, his friend was on the ground, knocked out cold. I froze for a second, my heart racing. The guy didn't even seem to care that he had just taken down his friend. He wasn't looking at him. He wasn't trying to help him. Instead, he started ramming his shoulder into the door, trying to force it open. I could hear the banging from across the restaurant, thudding against the glass. It was as if he didn't care that we were closed, that we had locked up. My stomach turned, and instinctively, I started to yell for my manager. He was always a bit more level-headed in these situations, and I hoped he'd know what to do. I ran out from the back and into the front, past the counter, where my manager was still doing paperwork in his office. He must have heard my voice, because by the time I turned around, he was stepping into the dining area. By the time my manager stepped out, Biggie Smalls' lookalike had taken his anger out on the door for a good couple of minutes. He wasn't giving up. He wasn't even flinching. His eyes were wild, and his movements were erratic. He kept slamming his body against the glass like he thought he could break through. I had no idea what was going through his head. I didn't even know what he wanted. Did he think we'd just give him food? Did he think he could break into the restaurant? My manager didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone, dialing 911. He didn't seem scared, but I could tell he was trying to keep things calm. The last thing we needed was for this to escalate even further. He stood a few feet away from the door, still talking on the phone. Biggie Smalls' lookalike looked over at him, and for the first time, he noticed what was going on. He looked at my manager for a split second, and then slowly, very slowly, he turned his head back to the window. Without breaking eye contact, he raised his middle finger at us. It was like he was daring us to try something. Then, just like that, he stopped. He took a step back, as if the anger had drained out of him. He turned around and walked back to his car. His friend, still unconscious, was lying slumped in the passenger seat. Biggie Smalls' lookalike didn't even seem to care. He just shoved his friend into the back seat with no effort at all, as if it was just another inconvenience for him. He got into the driver's seat, revved the engine, and looked at us one last time. His eyes met mine through the window, and in one final act of defiance, he flipped us the bird again. With a loud screech of tires, he peeled out of the parking lot, heading back into the night. I stood there, staring at the empty parking lot for a minute, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. My manager stayed on the phone with 911, giving them all the details. We knew we had to report it. He told me to make sure to lock up the doors, to double-check that everything was secure. We stayed on high alert for a while, just in case the guy came back. But he never did. Eventually, the 911 dispatcher hung up, and my manager gave me a nod. We had a bit of a debrief, talking about how we should handle situations like that moving forward. It wasn't a normal night, but in the end, nothing really came of it. The police showed up an hour later, took down our statements, and left. They never caught the guy, but we figured he was long gone. As the night dragged on, we finished cleaning up, but something about that encounter stuck with me. There was no real explanation for it. The guy wasn't just some guy who was upset because he didn't get his way. He was something else. There was an intensity to him, a raw aggression that made everything feel off. I kept replaying the moment in my head, the way he just ignored us, the way his anger seemed to come out of nowhere. But as the night wore on, the restaurant finally felt calm again. We locked up, shut down the lights, and walked out into the quiet, empty night. It wasn't until I was driving home that I realized just how close we had come to something much worse happening. We never saw him again. And honestly, I'm glad we didn't. It was the kind of neighborhood that wasn't really a neighborhood yet. My parents had moved into this new house, tucked away in a quiet area on the edge of a developing subdivision. The house itself wasn't much, just a small, single-story structure, with a kitchen that faced the front door. The lot next door was empty, and the others were either vacant or under construction. There were a lot of wild, open spaces around us, lots that hadn't been filled in with homes. It felt lonely, almost like the world around us hadn't caught up to the house. I was only about 3 at the time, so I don't really remember the details, but my parents told me about it often enough that I know the story inside and out. It's one of those things that you hear so much that it becomes a part of you, even if you weren't there to experience it yourself. It happened one night, a night like any other, or at least that's how my parents saw it. They'd settled into the new place, gotten used to the quiet, and the strange sounds that come with being in a house so isolated. The kitchen was toward the front of the house, right next to the door, which was sunken a little bit below the level of the living room. The front door wasn't exactly in the best spot either, a little awkwardly placed, like the house was still adjusting to being there. The door faced out into nothing but empty space, with barely any streetlights to cut through the dark. It was late, really late. My mom remembers the time being somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning. My dad had stayed up a little later than usual, watching TV or reading, trying to wind down from a long day of work. Mom, being a new mom, was probably half awake, listening for my little noises, making sure I was okay in my crib. And then, just like that, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a light tap or a polite knock. It was loud, aggressive even, the kind of knock that would wake you from a deep sleep. My dad, startled, got up and went to the kitchen window. The front door wasn't far, so it made sense to open it that way. He opened the kitchen window and looked out into the darkness, his voice cutting through the silence. "Who's there?" he called out. There was a pause, a brief moment of silence that stretched on for what must have felt like an eternity, and then a voice called back to him. "Help! I'm hurt. Let me in. I need to call an ambulance." The voice was rough and panicked, but there was something about it that made my dad pause. The guy sounded desperate, maybe even genuinely in trouble. But my dad wasn't about to open the door in the middle of the night to some stranger who might be in trouble. Now, you have to understand, my dad was young, a new dad. He had a wife and a little baby in the house. And while he wasn't necessarily a paranoid man, he was cautious, especially with the way the neighborhood still felt empty. There weren't a lot of neighbors around, and it was the kind of place where you felt isolated. No streetlights, no busy roads, nothing to break up the blackness of the night. Still, he tried to be reasonable. "Wait there," he called back. "I'll call an ambulance." He wasn't being rude. He was just trying to get some space, to process the situation and figure out the right course of action. But the stranger outside didn't seem to want any of that. The voice came back, louder now, angrier. "No, you have to let me in. I'm hurt. I'm dying. Please, just let me in." There was a sharp edge to his voice, something that sounded like frustration and fear mixed together. But there was also something off about it, like a sense of urgency that didn't sit right with my dad. He took a breath, trying to stay calm. He turned to go get the phone, probably to call the ambulance like he'd said, but before he could even reach for it, the banging stopped. The voice stopped, and when he went back to the window, there was no one in sight. The man had disappeared. My dad, a little confused but still on edge, closed the window and locked it tight. He told my mom what happened, but both of them were unsettled. My mom remembers looking at the clock and feeling like time had somehow slipped away during that whole exchange. They didn't know what had happened or why the man was so insistent on coming in. It didn't make sense, but that wasn't the end of it. Later that night, after everything had gone quiet again, they heard something. My mom remembers it as a soft noise at first, just a faint tapping on the back door. But it wasn't just tapping, it was more like banging, like fists pounding against the wood, forceful and insistent. The back door was a lot more secure than the front. My dad had made sure to put in a big, custom-built wooden fence around the backyard. It wasn't just for privacy, it was built to keep animals out. The fence was around 15 feet high, solid, with thick wooden planks, and it had locks on the gates that were nearly impossible to bypass. It wasn't the kind of thing that someone could easily climb over. Yet there it was. Someone was banging on the back door. My dad, already on high alert, opened the kitchen window again, this time yelling into the night. "I've called the cops. Get off my property," he shouted. And just like that, the banging stopped. No more sounds. The night went eerily quiet again. My dad didn't know what to make of it. He spent the rest of the night lying awake, trying to convince himself it was just a prank or some odd coincidence. But deep down, something didn't sit right with him. When he left for work the next morning, everything seemed normal again. The neighborhood was still empty. The house was quiet. But as my dad opened the front door to leave, there it was, something strange, sitting on the porch. A bottle of what looked like wine, with a label that simply read, "Wine. Thanks for the help." The bottle was sealed, but what caught my dad's attention wasn't the bottle itself, it was the label. It didn't look like it had been written with a pen or printed normally. The handwriting looked smudged, uneven, and there was something about it that made him uneasy. My mom remembers seeing it too. She swears that the label was written in blood, though my dad didn't want to believe it. He wasn't sure if it was red ink or something else entirely, but he didn't want to take any chances. They threw the bottle away immediately. They didn't even dare open it to see what was inside. The whole experience left my parents shaken. They couldn't understand who would do something like that, or why. What had the man wanted? And what was the significance of the bottle? The whole thing felt like a warning, though they couldn't figure out what kind of warning it was. Over the years, they moved on, but every now and then, when they talked about that night, there was always this underlying tension. The questions that never got answered, the fear that lingered even after the strange events had passed. They never felt comfortable in that house again, and the strange feeling that hung over the whole experience never really left them. As for me, I've always wondered what could have happened if my dad had let that man inside. What was he really after? And who would leave a message like that on the doorstep, with such a strange, ominous feeling attached to it? The bottle, the knock in the middle of the night, the banging on the back door. It all seemed like some kind of message. A warning, or a test, or something worse. Even after all these years, my parents haven't really talked about it much, and neither have I. It's one of those things you just don't talk about because, deep down, you know you might never fully understand it. What we do know, though, is that we're lucky nothing worse came from it. Whatever that man's intentions were, whatever message he was trying to send, we'll never know. but we never forgot the feeling that night left behind. I used to work at a grocery store. Nothing special about it, just your regular kind of place, the one you'd go to after work to grab a few items or stock up on snacks for the weekend. I had been working there for a while, mostly in the back, doing stock and setting up the dairy cooler. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept me busy, and honestly, I didn't mind. The dairy cooler was cold, obviously, but the peace and quiet down there made it easy to get lost in the rhythm of stocking the shelves with milk, yogurt, and cheese. It was a break from the hustle and bustle of the rest of the store, where you could hear people talking, carts rolling around, and the constant hum of the cash registers. This particular shift started like any other. I was in the dairy cooler, stocking up on the usual stuff: milk, butter, eggs. The fluorescent lights flickered above, and the hum of the cooling unit was constant in the background. I had my phone on me, as I always did, and I was listening to music while I worked. My ringtone was a classic, Rick Ross's Hustlin'. The track was loud and unmistakable, with that iconic, "Every day I'm hustling," blasting from my phone. The beat was always enough to keep me awake and in a good mood, even if the job itself wasn't that exciting. I had just finished a call when I heard it, the ringtone. It was faint, almost like it was coming from far away. At first, I thought maybe it was just in my head. I had just heard it on the phone, after all. But it didn't stop. It kept playing, looping over and over, but it wasn't coming from my phone. It was coming from somewhere inside the cooler, faint but clear enough for me to hear. The song was just repeating, "Every day I'm hustling," again and again. I thought maybe I was just losing it, going crazy after spending so many hours in the cooler, but it sounded like my phone, my ringtone. The kicker was that there was no vibration, no buzzing. It wasn't my phone. There was no reason for it to be looping in the way it was, especially since I hadn't touched it. I froze for a second, not really sure what to do. It was one of those moments where I couldn't quite explain what was happening, but it felt strange, unsettling. After a minute of this, I called up my co-worker Dave. He was working the floor that night, but we were on decent terms, and I figured, why not have him come down and check it out? Maybe he'd hear it too, and we could both try to figure out what the hell was going on. "Hey Dave, can you come down to the cooler for a sec?" I asked. "Yeah, what's up?" he replied, sounding like he was in the middle of something. "Just come down here. I hear something, and I want to see if it's just me." I hung up and waited. It wasn't long before he showed up, stepping into the cold with his usual relaxed demeanor. He walked in, looking around like he didn't know what I was talking about. The cooler was massive, with huge shelves lined with products, and the cooling unit was humbling in its size and power. There was a lot of noise in there, between the cooling unit and the constant shuffle of items being moved around. It's easy to get lost in that space. At first, Dave didn't hear anything. I don't know if I was just too focused on it, but he looked around and shook his head. "I don't hear anything, man. You sure you're not tripping?" he asked, trying to sound calm. But then it happened again. The ringtone, just as faint as before, like it was echoing somewhere far off. But this time it wasn't just in my head. It was there. Dave stopped moving, and his eyes flicked around the cooler, trying to find the source. "Wait, you hear that, right?" he asked. I nodded. It wasn't my phone. It wasn't anything that should have been happening. The music was still faint, looping in the background, repeating the same few seconds of Rick Ross's voice. Neither of us had any explanation for it, but it was definitely real. And it wasn't coming from anywhere obvious. After a few seconds, we both stood still, listening, trying to figure out if maybe the cooling unit was messing with the sound. But the cooling system was pretty standard, nothing unusual about it. It definitely didn't play music. "All right, this is weird," Dave muttered. He didn't seem scared or anything, just genuinely confused. We spent a few more minutes standing in the cooler, the looping ringtone playing in the background. Neither of us knew what to make of it. It wasn't coming from our phones, and it didn't sound like it was coming from any of the equipment. It was just there, repeating itself. "I'm telling you, it's weird, man. I hear it too," Dave said, clearly starting to get a little uncomfortable. For the rest of my shift, I kept hearing it. The ringtone played over and over, looping in the background like some kind of glitch in the air itself. It wasn't like a normal ringtone either. There were no vibrates, no phone buzzes, just this strange, repeating sound. Curious, I started calling more co-workers into the cooler just to see if anyone else could hear it. I didn't say anything at first. I just asked them to come in, then asked if they could hear any music. Most of them just looked at me like I was crazy. But then some started to stop and listen closely. Some were just confused, not hearing anything at all, but others, about 60% of them, I'd say actually heard it. It was faint, but enough for them to acknowledge it. And then 20% of those people, seriously, heard the exact song. Every day I'm hustling to. Not exactly the type of thing you'd expect to hear in a grocery store cooler. But there it was, the same song looping endlessly. I didn't know what to think. The cooling unit, the magnets, the building itself, none of it seemed to explain it. I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality, but then again, everyone else could hear it. I wasn't the only one hearing it now. I wasn't going crazy. The song continued to loop for the rest of my shift. I started to wonder if it would ever stop, but it didn't. It was like some weird glitch in the air, or maybe it was the cooler doing something strange. Maybe it was the magnets, the machinery, or just the weird acoustics of the space. Who knows? I didn't have an explanation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the time my shift ended, I was ready to leave. The song had played for hours, and it was starting to mess with my head. When I stepped out of the cooler, I could still hear it faintly in the back of my mind, even though the rest of the store was quiet. I wasn't sure if it was real anymore, or if I was just stuck in some weird loop of my own. The next morning, I came into work, feeling like I might have just been tripping out the night before. Maybe I'd been tired, maybe the coolers had messed with my brain somehow, but when I stepped into the store, everything felt normal. For a moment, I thought maybe it was all in my head, but then I realized I hadn't heard the song since I left last night, and that was a relief. I asked around the next day, and nobody seemed to remember hearing it the way I did. Dave hadn't heard it the next day either. Everyone just kind of shrugged it off, like it was nothing. Maybe it was just me being tired or stressed from the long hours. The weird thing, though, was that it stuck with me for days. I kept thinking about that loop, the sound echoing through the cooler. It never really went away. I've worked in that cooler 100 times since, but every now and then, I'll get a little paranoid, thinking I might hear that song again. But it never comes back. It's like it was some weird glitch in time, or maybe I just heard things, but the truth is I don't know. Whatever happened that night, it was one of those things that left me with more questions than answers. Maybe the cooler's magnets had some weird effect on my phone. Maybe it was the acoustics of the space messing with my head. I'll never really know. But for that shift, that was the strangest thing I'd ever experienced at work. And I'm okay with never figuring it out. Sometimes, things don't need explanations. They just need to be left as strange memories of a day that's now just another weird chapter in the story of my life. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I woke up. I wasn't sure why, but my mouth felt dry, and I really needed to use the bathroom. The room was pitch dark except for the faint light coming from the street lamp outside that barely lit up the corner of my room. The kind of light that you only notice when everything else is completely black. I looked at my phone and saw it was 2:32, so I had just woken up in the middle of the night. I carefully swung my legs off the bed and felt the cold wooden floor against my feet. My room was tiny, and the bathroom was just across the hall. I shuffled out, trying not to make too much noise, because I didn't want to wake anyone else up. The house was silent, not a single sound, except for the creaking of the floorboards under my feet. After using the bathroom and getting the drink of water, I made my way back to my room. Everything felt normal, completely normal. The house was still quiet, the night still deep. I didn't think much of it. I shut the bathroom door softly and walked back to my room. As I reached for the door handle to my bedroom, I noticed something odd. There was no reason for it, but my gut told me something wasn't right. My heart was racing, and I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the isolation of the house, or maybe it was the eerie quiet that night. But I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing. I opened the door, slipped inside, and closed it behind me. The sound of the latch clicking into place was oddly comforting. But that comfort didn't last. No sooner had I laid back down on my bed and pulled the covers over me than I heard it, the scratching sound at the door. It was faint at first, like someone trying to drag their nails across the wood. I froze, heart in my throat. My eyes shot to the door. But there was nothing there. Nothing at all. My room was pitch black, and the only source of light was that dim sliver of street lamp outside. My breath caught in my throat as I sat there, straining to hear the sound again. Scratching. It came again, but this time it was louder, more distinct. I don't know why, but I immediately felt like I wasn't alone. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I don't have pets. I don't have any animals in the house, not even a stray cat or anything. I wanted to scream. I wanted to leap out of bed, but I didn't. My body was frozen, completely paralyzed, as I stared at the door in front of me. The scratching persisted for a moment, then stopped. I had to know if I was dreaming, so I bit myself. Not hard, just enough to feel the sting. It hurt like hell. The pain was sharp, undeniable. I wasn't dreaming. But why the hell was this happening? The scratching stopped, but now my mind was racing, trying to find an explanation. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe the house settling. But the quiet in my room, there was no wind, no creaking of old walls. Just silence, and the strange feeling that something was wrong. I turned to face the window, hoping that whatever it was, it would just go away. But the moment I closed my eyes, I felt it. Cold air on my face, a soft, almost imperceptible breath against my skin. It wasn't like a breeze from the window. It was right there, in the room, on my face, and it felt so wrong. Like something, or someone, was standing right in front of me, breathing in my face. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my body tense up with panic. I didn't want to open my eyes. I was too scared. I didn't know what was there, but I knew I didn't want to see it. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, constricted with fear. The breathing continued, slow and steady, and it felt like it was getting closer, almost like whatever it was hovering right in front of me. My mind spun into a frenzy, thinking about every possible nightmare scenario. I didn't dare open my eyes. I just kept them closed, hoping whatever it was would just go away. It felt like hours passed. I could feel the cold breath still on my face. I tried to focus on anything other than the panic building in my chest, but it was useless. I kept waiting, hoping for the breathing to stop, hoping for the terror to end. But it didn't. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing stopped. Just like that, the room fell silent again. But I was too scared to move, too scared to open my eyes. I stayed there, curled up in the bed, shaking, my heart still pounding in my chest. Every nerve in my body was on fire, and the fear kept me from even thinking clearly. I don't know how much time passed before I gathered enough courage to open my eyes. The room was still dark. The door was closed, just as I had left it. But as I turned my head towards the window, I saw it. A figure. At first, I couldn't make out what it was. It was just a shadow, something in the corner of my vision, standing still. I froze. I stared at it, trying to figure out if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as soon as I focused on it, it screamed. The scream was high-pitched and shrill, not human at all. It pierced my ears, and I couldn't process what I was hearing. I closed my eyes again immediately, pressing my hands against my ears to block it out. I curled up into a ball on the bed, shaking uncontrollably. The scratch on my arm, a sharp, burning pain, was the only thing I felt in that moment, and it sent a shockwave of terror through me. But I couldn't bring myself to look at it. I couldn't face it. I just lay there, trembling, unable to move, my mind filled with pure fear. I don't know how long I lay there. Maybe minutes. Maybe hours. My entire body felt numb, and I was too afraid to open my eyes again. I just wanted it to end. Finally, I must have passed out. I don't remember anything after that. When I woke up the next morning, the sun had just started to rise, and the room looked normal again. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a horrible dream. I sat up, my body still shaking, and instinctively my eyes went to my arm. I couldn't believe what I saw. Scratch marks. Deep ones. They ran across my arm, and there was dried blood. I felt a sickening wave of panic rise in my chest as I stared at the marks. The fear from the night before hit me all over again. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know what it was. But I knew it wasn't a dream. I had no answers, and no one I talked to could give me one either. Some people suggested it was sleep paralysis, but I knew better. I was fully aware of everything around me. I could move, I could feel, and I was in complete control of my body. But I had no explanation for what had happened. No explanation for the breathing, for the figure, or for the scream. For weeks, I couldn't sleep without the lights on. I'd get up, check the door, and even peek under the bed. Every time the clock showed 2:30 a.m., a chill ran down my spine. The fear of that hour haunted me. Even if I looked at my phone and saw the time, I felt that same knot in my stomach. I couldn't explain it, but I feared that hour like nothing else. It was 2 years ago when this happened, and I still haven't been able to shake the fear of it. The memory sticks with me like a shadow that never fades. I don't know what it was. I don't know what happened that night, and I probably never will. But I do know this. Whatever it wasn't human. And every time I even think about it, I still feel that cold breath on my face, the scratch on my arm, and the scream that will never leave me. Now, I refuse to get up between 2 and 3 a.m. I can't. If I wake up during those hours, I stay in bed, hoping the minutes will pass without anything happening. It's a fear that lingers, a fear that won't let me go, and it's something I'll never forget. I was late to the campfire that night, and as I hurried to catch up, I could hear the faint crackle of the wood and the occasional burst of laughter from my friends. I knew I'd get there eventually, but I had a story in mind, a story I hadn't shared with anyone before. Something that was too terrifying to keep to myself anymore. It all started a few years ago, back when we lived just outside Portland, Oregon. You wouldn't think there was much wilderness just outside the city, but if you knew where to look, there were these incredible hiking trails hidden in the forests that lead you up to the cliffs overlooking the Columbia Gorge. The views of the river were breathtaking, especially when you were high enough to see it winding its way through the trees, the mist rising in the early morning. Back then, I spent a lot of time with my buddy Alex. He had a mom who loved the outdoors, loved hiking in particular. She was this kind of person who was always in search of peace, always on a quest for solitude. She'd hike alone, usually on the weekends, escaping into the woods for hours at a time. And she didn't do it for any sort of physical challenge or need for exercise. She just did it because she loved it. The view, the quiet, the feeling of being far away from everything, just with her thoughts. And she did it with this odd sense of dedication. You know the kind of person I'm talking about, the one who doesn't need anything fancy, no new gear, no phones, no modern tech. This was an age when people still used disposable cameras, and that's exactly what she'd bring with her on every hike. A cheap disposable camera with just a roll or two of film to document her journey. She had this ritual. She would hike up these familiar paths, usually around the same time each day, so she'd catch the golden glow of sunset over the gorge, and then rise early enough to watch the sunrise. She wasn't trying to make a big statement with her photos, didn't show them to anyone. She was simply capturing the moments for herself. There was something about the process that she found peaceful, almost spiritual. She'd go out in the late afternoon, snap pictures of the sunset, then sleep out there for the night in her sleeping bag. In the morning, she'd snap some pictures of the sunrise and head back home, refreshed and content. She kept this up for 3 months straight. Every weekend, without fail. The same trails, the same views, the same pattern. I didn't think much of it at the time, her routine, that is, because it seemed like a nice, harmless way to escape the grind of everyday life. It wasn't until one day when she returned from one of her weekend hikes that things took a turn for the strange. She came home, as usual, with the camera roll from her weekend hike, excited to get her photos developed. It was a little ritual of hers to drop off her film at the local Walgreens, and then pick up the prints a few days later. She was never in a hurry for the pictures. They weren't precious moments, just images that captured her experience on the trail. But when she got the prints back that next week, she wasn't expecting what she found. The first few photos were just as she had anticipated, pictures of the sunset. The gorge stretched out before her in brilliant reds and oranges. She had framed the photos perfectly, the colors exploding in the sky as the sun dipped below the horizon. Beautiful, peaceful, exactly what you'd expect. But then, the next set of photos puzzled her. In the middle of the packet, there were several pictures of her sleeping in her sleeping bag, zipped up tight, surrounded by the dark woods. There was one picture where she was lying on her side, her face partly obscured by the hood of her sleeping bag, the light from the fire she'd presumably built casting strange shadows around her. The thing that made her pause, what made her stomach drop, was that in none of those photos had she remembered being awake. There were no signs that anyone had taken the photos. No one had been there. She'd been alone the whole time, hadn't she? But there was something about those photos that unnerved her. She had always been careful to lock her campsite up, to make sure no one could sneak up on her. She never let herself fall asleep in a way that would leave her vulnerable. She had the feeling deep down that something had been off about the whole thing. But she brushed it aside, telling herself that it was just paranoia. Maybe the light from the fire had played tricks on her, or maybe she had asked someone to take the picture without remembering. She wasn't sure, but she let it go. That was until she reached the last few photos in the roll. The final pictures were of the sunrise. Just like usual, nothing particularly out of the ordinary. The first few shots showed the light of dawn creeping over the horizon, the sky painted with pinks and purples, the gorge taking on a whole new character in the soft light of the morning. But there was something wrong about the final picture. In that one, the view was still the same. The sunrise still illuminated the sky. But there, in the corner of the frame, almost obscured by the trees, was a figure. A dark shape, clearly human, but not someone she recognized. No one had been out there with her. She was sure of it. She hadn't seen anyone when she woke up. No one had passed by her campsite. It was just her and the forest. But in the photo, there was someone standing in the trees, looking directly at the camera. The figure was too far away to make out any details, but it was definitely there, watching. Her heart raced as she turned the pictures over, trying to make sense of it. She examined the photo again and again, convinced she was imagining things. But the more she looked, the more she realized something. There was a sense of wrongness to it. The figure wasn't just standing there. They seemed to be standing still, unnaturally still, in a place where no one should be. It wasn't just the photo that disturbed her, it was the thought of someone being there at all, in such an isolated place, at such an odd hour. She thought about going back to the trail, retracing her steps to see if anyone had been in the area. But the fear that had settled deep in her gut kept her from doing that. What if they were still out there? What if they were watching her the whole time? It wasn't until several months later that she finally mentioned it to me, sitting across from me at a local coffee shop, her hands trembling as she told the story. By then, she had thrown away the disposable camera and stopped hiking those trails altogether. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following her, had been in the woods with her, watching her, waiting. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something else that chilled me. The photo of the figure. Whoever it was, they had been standing just outside her camp, just outside her sleeping bag. How had they gotten so close without her noticing? How could they have moved through the woods without making a sound? She told me that she'd never returned to that spot again. She'd driven up to the trailhead once, only to turn around halfway there, gripped with an overwhelming sense of fear. She didn't want to be out there again, not knowing who or what had been watching her. I didn't think much about it until I went camping with some friends on those same trails a couple of years later. We were out near the gorge, about an hour's hike from the trailhead, when something happened that made my blood run cold. I was sitting by the fire when I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, someone moving in the trees, just at the edge of the light from the fire. I froze, trying to make sense of it, but the moment I stood up to look, whatever it was vanished into the darkness. I brushed it off as a deer or some other animal, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. It was just too eerily familiar. And then I remembered my buddy's mom's story, the pictures, the figure watching her. The thought that someone could be out there in the dark, just waiting, had never seemed so real. We packed up and left early the next morning. I never spoke about it with anyone, but I think we all shared the same sense of unease. We weren't alone out there, and we didn't want to find out who else might be wandering the forest at night. So, as I made my way toward the campfire, I told my friends the story. By the time I finished, they were all quiet, staring into the fire, the flickering light casting long shadows across their faces. It was a story that would never leave me, a story I couldn't forget. Because sometimes, in places like those forests near the Columbia Gorge, the scariest thing isn't the things you can see, it's the ones you can't. I had always been a curious person, sometimes to the point where it backfired. That's what this was, a case of me taking something too far, thinking I could cheat my way into something I barely understood. I had just read about lucid dreaming. The whole idea of it fascinated me. Being able to control your dreams, walk around inside them, fly, create things, do whatever you wanted in a world made entirely by your own mind. It sounded incredible. But the training part, the dream journals, the mantras, the constant reality checks during the day, it all sounded like too much effort. I didn't have the patience for that. Then I stumbled across a shortcut method online. They said you could force yourself into a lucid dream without months of training if you lay down and kept completely still. The trick was to lie on your back, Keep your eyes shut and not move a single muscle, not even to scratch an itch. No twitching, no repositioning. The goal was to let your body fall asleep while your mind stayed awake. Supposedly, around the 30-minute mark, you'd start to feel strange things, your limbs going numb, maybe a feeling of floating or sinking, and if you held out long enough, you'd slide right into a lucid dream. It sounded too good to be true, but I figured why not? I was alone in the apartment that weekend. My roommate had gone home for a family thing, so I had the place to myself. Quiet, dark, no one to disturb me. Perfect for experimenting. That night I set up everything. I turned off all the lights, unplugged anything that might glow, and made sure my phone was silenced and flipped face down. I lay down on my bed flat on my back, arms to my sides, eyes closed. I even made sure to go to the bathroom first, so there would be no distractions. I was ready. I reminded myself of the rule, don't move no matter what. The first few minutes were fine. Boring, honestly. My mind wandered a little. I kept thinking about stupid things, like what I'd eat tomorrow or whether I'd left the oven on. Then my nose itched. That was the first test. It wasn't a small itch either. It was the kind of itch that seems to multiply the more you ignore it, like it's spreading across your face, into your eyebrows, down into your cheek. I clenched my teeth, thinking this would pass if I just focused. 10 minutes in, or what I guessed was 10 minutes, my arms started to feel heavy. Not tired, but weirdly weighted, like they didn't belong to me anymore. My legs too. I was starting to get a little excited, thinking maybe it was working. But then came the pins and needles. My feet went first, just a soft tingle at first, like they'd fallen asleep. It crept up to my ankles, then into my calves. My hands were next. I wanted to shake them out so badly, but I kept still. Somewhere around what I figured was the 20-minute mark, the itch was gone, replaced by a growing sense of detachment from my body. My chest felt light, my breathing shallow, and my ears started picking up on every tiny sound. A clock ticking somewhere, the fridge humming. It all seemed louder, clearer. I was still calm, though. This was supposed to happen. Then 30 minutes passed. At least, that's how long it felt. Nothing else happened. No floating, no sinking, no dream world. I remember thinking, this is a waste of time. I was annoyed more than anything. I was about to give up and roll over when I heard a sound. It came from outside my room. A dull, soft bump. Not loud, but distinct. It wasn't something falling. It was deliberate, like a footstep. I stayed still, listening. A few seconds later, I heard it again. Another step. I lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment. The sound came from just outside my bedroom door, maybe in the hallway. I knew I was alone. My heart started beating faster. I thought maybe I was just hearing things. I tried to speak, to call out, ask who was there, but nothing came out. My mouth wouldn't move. That's when I realized I couldn't move anything at all. My body was frozen. Completely. I wasn't numb anymore. I could feel everything, the fabric of my shirt, the blanket on my legs, even the slight breeze from the ceiling fan. But I couldn't move. Not my fingers, not my toes. Not even my eyes. Then the doorknob clicked. Just a tiny metallic sound. My heart felt like it skipped a beat. I waited, completely paralyzed, listening as the doorknob was pushed down. Slowly, like someone trying not to make noise. It moved halfway down, then stopped. I stared at the inside of my eyelids, helpless. It went down again. Then again. Not hard, but steady like someone testing it. Then it started again and again, faster, harder, until it was rattling. The door wasn't locked. I don't know why it didn't open. Maybe it had caught on the carpet or the frame. But whoever was out there was now trying hard to open it. I could hear them shifting their weight, bumping into the door, yanking the handle down like they were losing patience. At that point, I wasn't scared anymore. Something switched off in my brain. It was like all my thoughts drained out and were replaced by something raw and ugly. Rage. Just white-hot anger, sharp and bitter, rising in my chest like it was going to burst through me. I wanted to fight, to destroy whoever was behind that door. The words kill, kill, kill repeated in my mind like a loop. Not because I was trying to think that, it just happened. I couldn't stop it. Then suddenly I could move. I snapped up like I'd been shot with electricity. My whole body was drenched in sweat, shirt stuck to my back, mouth bone dry. I stood up so fast my legs almost gave out. I didn't think. I charged straight to the door and yanked it open. The hallway was empty. The whole apartment was dead silent. I checked every room. The bathroom. The kitchen. Even my roommate's room. Nothing. All the windows were still shut, locked. The front door was still bolted from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing knocked over. Still, I wasn't convinced. I stood in the middle of the living room, heart pounding, listening. I stayed there for a long time, waiting for the slightest sound. But the only thing I heard was the fridge turning on again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there on the couch, lights on, facing the hallway. I don't remember when I finally passed out, but when I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight coming through the blinds, birds chirping outside like nothing ever happened. I tried to tell myself it was a dream. Sleep paralysis, a trick of the mind. But that doesn't explain the wet handprint on the outside of my bedroom door. Low, like someone crouching. I didn't show anyone. I wiped it off before my roommate got home. I didn't want to explain it. I didn't want to talk about it. Hell, I barely wanted to think about it. Since that night, I can't sleep on my back anymore. Even lying on my stomach makes my skin crawl. I sleep on my side, curled up, every night without fail. I've never tried lucid dreaming again. I never will. Something changed that night. I don't know what I saw or what happened or whether I imagined all of it, but the feeling stayed with me. That rage, that helplessness, the sick hunger for violence that boiled up out of nowhere. It scared me more than whatever was outside that door. It's still there, somewhere deep down. Every now and then, when I hear a noise in the middle of the night, or someone startles me, it flashes for a second, just a second, and it's enough to remind me that I was not myself that night. Or maybe I was. Maybe that's what scared me the most. That it was always in me, just waiting for the right moment to wake up. I keep the bedroom door locked now, and I never, ever lie completely still. When I was around 8 or 9, something strange happened to me one night. I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or if it was something else, but the memory of it still sticks with me like it happened yesterday. It was the kind of experience that, even now, I can't fully explain. Not that it was anything supernatural. I'm not one for that kind of stuff. But whatever it was definitely one of the weirdest things that's ever happened to me. It all started one night when I went to sleep like I normally did. I had a very vivid dream, but I can't recall most of it now, except for one part. I remember just falling off a cliff, like in one of those Wile E. Coyote cartoons, where everything is exaggerated and strange. You know how, when you fall in a dream, you're supposed to wake up with a jolt? I was expecting that like I usually did, but this time, something was different. I didn't wake up right away. Instead, I felt a weird floating sensation, like my body was weightless for a few seconds. It felt so real. I remember wondering for a split second if I was really falling or if I was just dreaming, but then I felt myself hit the ground. Not hard, but solid. I woke up, or at least I thought I woke up. The first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes was that I wasn't in the same position I had been in when I went to bed. My back was pressed against the foot of my bed, and I was laying flat on the floor. I could feel the coolness of the wood beneath me, and it was jarring, like I'd just fallen from a height. But the strange thing was, I didn't feel like I'd fallen out of bed. It wasn't like I had rolled off or had some kind of weird toss. It felt like I was placed there, positioned perfectly perpendicular to the foot of my bed. I stood up quickly, still groggy from sleep, trying to make sense of it. As I rubbed my eyes, I looked around my room, trying to figure out what had just happened. My first instinct was to check my bed. I figured I'd rolled off, maybe, or sleepwalked or something. But when I looked at my bed, I froze. The sheets were perfectly made. Perfectly. Like someone had come in and remade my bed while I was sleeping. The blankets were straight, the pillows were fluffed, and there wasn't a wrinkle anywhere. It was as if I had never been lying there at all. But I had. I knew I had. I had fallen asleep in that bed only hours before, and now everything was perfect. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the bed, trying to wrap my head around it. I wasn't scared, not really, but I was confused. My mind was foggy, and I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. After what felt like forever, I decided to just go back to sleep. It was the easiest thing to do. I figured it was just some weird dream, or my mind playing tricks on me. So I climbed back into bed, pulled the covers over myself, and drifted off to sleep again. I don't remember much about the next few hours, but I do remember waking up in the morning, feeling groggy, but generally fine. I had a vague recollection of the night before, but it was more like a strange memory, like something that didn't fully belong in my mind. As I got up, I thought about the night's events. I could still see the image of my bed, how perfectly made it had been, how I had been on the floor, but my bed was immaculate. I didn't really dwell on it, though. It was one of those things that, in the moment, just seemed too weird to try and explain. I chalked it up to a strange dream. Maybe I had sleepwalked or something. That was about all I could make of it at the time. But a few years later, it happened again. I don't know exactly how old I was this time, but I was a little older. Maybe 12 or 13. I remember going to bed the way I always did. It was a normal night, no different than any other. But then, the dream came again. I fell, just like before, but this time it felt even stranger. I wasn't falling for as long, but I could still feel that weird floating sensation, like I was suspended in midair. It didn't make sense. And then, just like before, I woke up. But this time, I didn't land on the floor. I was back in bed. But it wasn't just that I was back in bed. I could feel the difference. I had landed back in my bed, like I had been dropped back into it from a few inches up in the air. It was like I had been picked up and placed back in bed. I didn't know how high I had been, but I knew I hadn't just rolled back over. I could feel the sheets on my legs, the blankets around me. But it was weird. It wasn't a normal waking up. I lay there for a long time, trying to figure out what was going on. My mind was racing. I kept thinking about what had happened, about the feeling of being lifted and placed back into bed. It wasn't like sleepwalking or anything I could explain. It was like I had been physically moved without ever knowing it. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was happening because I wasn't fully awake. Like something wasn't right with my sleep, and my body was doing something it shouldn't have been. I eventually fell asleep again, but that was the last time it happened. It's been years since then, and I haven't had another experience like that. I've tried to make sense of it in so many ways. Maybe I had some weird form of sleepwalking or some sort of sleep disorder. Maybe my brain was tricking me into thinking I was falling, and my body just reacted in a strange way. But honestly, I don't know. I'll never be sure. The one thing I do know is that I've never been able to shake the feeling that something unusual happened. Something I still can't explain. I've thought about it off and on over the years, but every time I do, I can't come up with a rational explanation. I mean, I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that. But whatever it was that happened, it wasn't normal. And I'll never forget the feeling of waking up in a place that wasn't where I had fallen asleep. It's one of those experiences that leaves you wondering if your mind is playing tricks on you, or if something else is going on that you just don't understand. For years, I've told myself it was a dream. But every now and then, when I think back to that night, I still can't help but wonder. I was about 9 years old when this all happened. It was a regular summer afternoon, hot and sticky, the kind of heat that always makes you want to just stay inside where it's cooler. I was over at my friend's house, hanging out with him and his younger sister, who was only 5 at the time. Our moms were in the kitchen, talking about who knows what. We were used to being sent off to play downstairs whenever they had long conversations. It was no big deal. We spent hours down there, usually just playing games or watching cartoons. But this time, things felt different. We were heading down the old wooden stairs, the kind of stairs that creaked and groaned under your weight like they were trying to tell you to be careful. I was the first one down, and I heard it, the soft, almost eerie creak of the steps behind me as my friend and his sister followed. It was darker downstairs than usual, the basement light flickering a little as it struggled to stay on. We didn't think much of it, but as I was about to step off the last step, something caught my eye. There, standing in the doorway of one of the rooms, was a girl. At first, I thought it was just the weird lighting, or maybe one of my friend's cousins who had been over earlier in the week. But something was wrong. The figure, though clear enough to be seen, wasn't fully there. She looked translucent, almost like she was made out of air or smoke. It was like looking at a person through a thick, foggy window. Her features weren't entirely defined, but you could tell she was standing still, staring right at us. My heart dropped into my stomach. I froze, not sure what I was looking at or what I should do. My friend beside me whispered something under his breath, but I couldn't hear him. I felt my throat tighten, and then I noticed his sister, who was standing just a step behind us. She was already looking past me, her eyes wide with fear. Without a word, we all ran up the stairs, screaming as we went. The stairs seemed to stretch on longer than they ever had before, our feet pounding faster and faster, as we made our way back up into the safety of the kitchen. We didn't stop screaming until we were in the kitchen, where our moms were still talking. They just stared at us like we were crazy, but I could feel the cold sweat on my back. We never talked about what we saw. I don't know why, but something about that image haunted me for years. That same year, something else happened. It wasn't something I talked about much, but it stayed with me just as much as that translucent figure in the basement. I was up late one night. I remember the night clearly, cooler than usual, but still warm enough to make the air feel sticky. The kind of night where your mind won't quiet down no matter how hard you try. I had just finished watching a show on Bigfoot. I was scared of him for as long as I could remember, probably from all those late-night shows and stories. The idea of a huge, hairy creature lurking out in the woods terrified me. That night, after I turned off the TV, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I tried so hard to fall asleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. I kept thinking about Bigfoot, wondering if he was out there, in the woods near my house. I couldn't get the image of him out of my mind. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted off to sleep. Then I woke up. It wasn't from a sound or a noise. I just woke up, wide awake, my eyes snapping open to see the room bathed in that dull early morning light. I looked at the clock next to my bed. It was maybe 4 a.m., still dark outside, but I couldn't fall back to sleep. There was something about the silence in the house, the stillness that made me feel like I should be alert. I tossed the covers off and slowly stood up. My bare feet made no sound against the cold wooden floor as I walked down the hall to the kitchen. There was a picture on the wall in the hallway, one I'd seen 1,000 times before. It was of some sand dunes, with a bright blue sky above. I'd never really thought much about it, but this time, something was different. As I passed the picture, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A man, riding a horse, moving across the sand dunes. The figure wasn't just part of the picture. It was like it was moving, almost like the horse and rider were alive. I stopped in my tracks, blinking a few times, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, the figure was still there, crossing the dunes, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. Gone. Disappeared into the nothingness of the painting. I was frozen in place for what felt like forever. I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. I felt like I was caught in a dream, like nothing made sense anymore. I had to look away, but I couldn't take my eyes off the place where the rider had just disappeared. Finally, I took a step back, almost tripping over my own feet in the process. I turned, feeling my stomach twist in knots. I had to get out of the hall, away from that picture, away from whatever I had just witnessed. I walked quickly toward the kitchen, but as I passed the sliding door, I noticed something. It was wide open. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I froze. The night air rushed into the house, carrying with it the strange feeling of something being off. I walked to the door slowly, my heart racing. I had no idea why it was open. Why would anyone leave it open, especially at this time of night? I was starting to panic. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there. Bigfoot, of course. The thought that he might have come into the house, killed my family, and left a curse on me crossed my mind. I almost felt like I was going to lose it. I yelled for my mom, but there was no answer. I rushed into the kitchen, half expecting to see some huge, terrifying creature standing there. But instead, I saw the light from the kitchen spilling out into the hall, illuminating nothing but the empty space. That's when I heard the knock at the door. My uncle. He had shown up earlier than expected, coming in from out of the province. The relief that washed over me was almost too much to handle. It took me a moment to even comprehend that everything I had just felt was all because I had been in a half-awake state, my mind playing tricks on me. I had been terrified for no reason, but in my panic, I couldn't have known that. I ran to him, hugging him tightly, not even really knowing why I was so scared. The door was still wide open. The cold air still rushed in, and as I stood there in my uncle's arms, I realized that nothing was wrong. No Bigfoot, no curse, no haunted pictures. It had all been a mix of fear and exhaustion, my mind working overtime, creating a story that wasn't real. But the strange thing is, even after I found out the truth, the memory of the girl in the basement and the horse in the painting stayed with me. I don't know what it was, but something about those moments didn't feel entirely normal. It wasn't that I believed in ghosts or curses, but every now and then, when I would pass that picture in the hallway, I'd swear I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I didn't grow up with much, and by the time I got to high school, it was just me and my mom. She was a single parent, doing her best, but money was always tight. That's how we ended up staying in this huge house that didn't belong to us. It was owned by one of her friends, a guy she knew through work who was always traveling for business. He offered to let us stay there rent-free, as long as we kept the place clean and took care of the lawn and stuff while he was gone. It was a big opportunity for us, and we took it without much hesitation. The house itself was a monster. 2 stories, wide open floor plan, massive windows everywhere. It sat in a quiet suburban neighborhood, surrounded by trees that always seemed to sway a little too much, even on calm days. I never thought of it as haunted or anything. It didn't feel like a scary house. In fact, it was pretty modern inside. Clean, cold surfaces, polished floors, big bedrooms, minimal furniture. Too minimal, honestly. Something about how empty the house always felt made the space even bigger, like the rooms themselves were waiting for someone to come back. Most of the time, it was just me there. My mom worked long hours, and sometimes even double shifts. When she was home, it was fine. We watched TV, ate dinner late, talked about her job, my school stuff, whatever. But when she wasn't, and the sun went down, the size of that house really hit me. The silence was never complete. There were creaks, clicks, low groaning sounds as the air shifted inside all that open space. Nothing I hadn't heard in other houses before, but there was a strange consistency to them. They weren't random. They always seemed to happen in the same spots, at the same times of day. I noticed it early on, but I didn't say anything. I figured it was just how the place was built. One afternoon after school, I was in my room, sitting on the floor with my back against my bed. It was the side facing the door, which I always left cracked open. I was messing around on my guitar, not even trying to learn a song or anything, just strumming random chords, singing whatever came to mind. I liked being loud when I was home alone. It made the place feel smaller, like I was filling it with something. That day I was in a good mood, just letting my voice carry through the room as I held out a note. Then, as clear as anything I've ever heard, I heard another voice. It was just on the other side of the bed. It wasn't me. It couldn't have been. The voice started while I was already singing. There was overlap. It harmonized with me, just for a moment, just long enough for me to notice that it was real. And it was unmistakably human. Not an echo, not a trick of the ear. It was someone joining in. I stopped mid-note. As soon as I did, the voice cut off too. Dead silence. I didn't move. Not right away. I sat there, completely still, staring straight ahead at nothing, trying to figure out if I just imagined it. But I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. It was too clean, too distinct. I didn't hear it through the walls or from outside. It was inside my room, just beyond the bed. My entire body tensed up. I couldn't even look around at first. I felt something behind me, not like a presence or a ghost or whatever, but the way you feel someone walk into a room behind you. I pulled the covers off the bed, crawled underneath them like I was 7 years old again, and called my mom. She didn't pick up right away, but I kept calling, whispering into the phone, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When she finally answered, I didn't even say what happened. I just begged her to come home. She came home maybe 20 minutes later. I stayed under those covers the whole time, sweating, holding my phone with both hands like it was the only thing connecting me to reality. When I finally heard her car in the driveway, I ran out of the room and didn't go back in until the next morning. For a while, nothing else happened. I kept trying to convince myself it was just a weird auditory hallucination, something caused by being alone too much or by how quiet the house always was. I kept the door closed after that. I stopped singing out loud, especially when I was alone. But the weird part was, I didn't feel afraid most of the time. That one moment scared the hell out of me. Yeah, but the house itself didn't feel threatening. I felt like something had cracked open for a second, and then closed again. A few days before New Year's, I was bored and fell down a rabbit hole online about brainwave entrainment, basically using different sound frequencies to shift your mental state. I read that binaural beats could help with focus, meditation, even lucid dreaming. It sounded harmless, even kind of cool. I downloaded a binaural beat generator and played around with it for a while, eventually making my own preset. I set it to run for 10 minutes, with 2 tones slowly sweeping through the 10 Hz range in opposite directions. I wanted to feel more relaxed. That was the goal. So I put on my headphones, turned off the lights, lay down on my bed, and just let it play. The sounds were subtle, like distant hums moving past each other. It didn't feel like much at the time, maybe a little dizzying, but nothing dramatic. After 10 minutes, I took the headphones off, shrugged it off, and went about my night. The next day, my mom asked me to take the trash out. I grabbed the bags and walked through the house like normal, through the kitchen, past the laundry room, into the garage. I opened the garage door to the driveway and stepped out. As soon as I did, something above me shifted. About a foot over my head, these tiny glowing orbs started to swirl in a loose spiral. At least half a dozen of them, each about the size of a marble. They weren't floating in my eyes. I wasn't dizzy or blinking weird. These things were there. They had depth, they moved in space. They glowed faintly and soft, changing colors, blue, orange, pale green. They didn't make a sound. They just rotated slowly for maybe 3 or 4 seconds, and then vanished, like someone flipped a switch. I froze. I looked around, expecting maybe car lights, some trick of reflection, anything. But it wasn't that. There were no cars on the street. It was a gray, overcast day. No sun, no reflections. I just stood there, holding the trash bags, completely still. I didn't even throw them out. I went back inside and sat down on the couch, staring at the wall, trying to understand what I'd just seen. I never saw those orbs again. A couple of days later, it was New Year's Day. I had a shift at the grocery store up the street, Deerberg's. If you're from the Midwest, you've probably been in one. That day, like every New Year's, the store was practically empty. Most people were at home sleeping off hangovers or just taking the day off. I worked in produce, and I was scheduled to trim and package lettuce in the prep room behind the produce section. It was a closed-off space with a set of swinging doors and a separate entrance to the cooler in the back, which also had swinging hinges. It was just me back there. Not a single customer in the produce section, and I hadn't seen another employee for at least 30 minutes. I was focused on the lettuce, using one of those long industrial knives to chop and clean the heads before wrapping them. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw the cooler door swing open. It didn't just open, it swung with weight behind it, like someone had pushed through it quickly. I heard the hinge creak. I heard footsteps, fast ones. Someone taking 2 or 3 steps toward me. I turned instantly. There was no one there. The cooler door wasn't swinging. It was perfectly still. I stared at it, trying to catch my breath. My hand was still wrapped around the knife, and I realized then how tight my grip had gotten. I backed up slowly, pushing through the prep room doors and into the open store, knife still in hand, looking around for someone, *anyone's star. I eventually saw a couple of my co-workers up front by the registers, talking and laughing like it was just another shift. I didn't say anything to them. I just stood there, trying to make sense of it all. After a few minutes, I went back and finished my work, but I kept glancing at that cooler door. Every single sound made my skin crawl. After that, something in my head felt different. Not broken, not damaged, just changed. I started seeing things. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough that it stopped feeling like a coincidence. I'd be in the hallway at home, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see someone standing near the bathroom door. I'd turn my head, nothing. I'd see movement in the mirror that didn't match mine. I'd feel a shift in the room when no one else was home. It kept happening. The weirdest part was I got used to it. I stopped reacting. It became routine, almost like background noise. One day, I walked past the open basement door, and I knew someone was standing on the stairs. I saw the outline of them, just a shadow really, facing me motionless. But I didn't stop. I just kept walking, knowing full well that if I turned to look directly, nothing would be there. I started to think about the binaural beats. I hadn't used them again after that first time, but something about them stuck with me. It was like that 10-minute session peeled something back. Not in the house, not in the world around me, but in me. My brain felt tuned to a different frequency, just enough to notice things it hadn't noticed before. Not ghosts, not hallucinations, just fragments, moments, slips in perception. It went on like that for months. Eventually, the house stopped feeling big. The figures stopped showing up. The sounds faded. Everything returned to normal. I never used the beats again, and I didn't need to. Whatever door had opened, it seemed to close on its own. Years later, I can't say for sure what happened. Maybe it was stress, or isolation, or something chemical in my brain reacting to those sounds. Maybe it was just how that time in my life was unsettled, unpredictable. But I've never experienced anything like it again. And honestly, I don't miss it. It was a dark night about 2 years ago. The kind of dark where the trees seem like silhouettes against a starless sky, and the only light you get is from the faint glow of houses far off in the distance. I was 14, and with me were my two closest friends, Stacy and William. We'd been hanging out together forever, and I couldn't imagine spending a night with anyone else. They lived on the same block, just a few houses down from mine, and every house there opened up to a massive field that stretched for what seemed like miles. The field had a large flat area that spread out before a small hill, and then it flattened out again. On the hill stood two big trees, the kind that looked like they were ancient, even though they couldn't have been more than a couple decades old. That night, we were hanging out as we usually did, just the three of us. Stacy and I were sitting up in one of the trees, balancing on thick branches that twisted their way toward the sky, while William sat below us, leaning against the trunk. The air felt heavy, like something was waiting to happen, but I didn't think much of it. I guess you get used to that feeling when you're young, when you feel like the world is just out of reach, and everything seems like it's happening around you rather than with you. We were laughing at something trivial, like always, but then, out of nowhere, William shouted out. The sound startled us both, and I froze for a second, trying to understand what had happened. William's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet night air. Stacy and I both looked over at him, but he wasn't looking at us. His eyes were locked on the far edge of the field, the part furthest from the houses, the area where the lights ended and the shadows began. The edge of the field had a long stretch of darkness, as the houses at that end didn't have back porch lights, and the trees there blocked what little light came from the street lamps. The place had always felt eerie at night, but I'd never thought much of it. I figured it was just the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I turned to look in the direction William was staring. My eyes adjusted, and I squinted, trying to make out what he'd seen. Stacy leaned in next to me, her breathing sharp as she looked with me, trying to follow the line of sight. It took a few seconds, but then I saw it. A shape, maybe 8 of them. Figures that didn't quite make sense. At first, they were hard to make out, just shadows moving in the distance, but then something clicked, and I realized what they were. My stomach dropped. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They looked like deer crossed with bears, but not quite. They were huge, towering figures, bigger than any grizzly I'd ever seen. But there was something off about the way they moved. They were limber like deer, but not at all graceful. They didn't seem like animals you'd expect to see in that field. The creatures had hooves like deer, but their bodies were shaped like gorillas. Massive torsos and arms that looked like they were meant for swinging, but they ran mostly on their hind legs, their fists hitting the ground with every step like gorillas do when they run. The way they moved, fast, unnervingly fast, was what really scared me. They weren't walking or crawling. They were sprinting across the field like it was nothing. I could see them clearer now, their strange limbs stretching with each powerful stride. My breath caught in my chest, and for a second, I couldn't look away. It felt wrong. The way they moved, so fluidly and fast, it didn't seem possible. I was frozen, just watching as they ran, each of them gliding over the uneven ground with an unnatural speed. I glanced at Stacy, and her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open as she tried to process what she was seeing. William, still below us, had jumped up and was pointing at the figures, his voice barely a whisper now. I wanted to scream or run, but I couldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. The creatures had crossed most of the field in seconds, their speed terrifying. They reached the far end of the field, where the houses started, and there, just beyond a chain-link fence, were some trees that clustered near a house. The house was one of the few with a porch light, and the glow lit up the area around it enough that you could see everything in sharp detail. The figures, the creatures, they didn't slow down when they reached the trees. They didn't try to go around them, or jump, or climb. They just vanished. It wasn't like they ducked out of sight, or slipped behind the fence. No, they were there, and then they weren't. In the time it took for me to blink, they were gone, vanished into the air. I had no explanation for it. I could see the area clearly enough. There was no way they could have gone anywhere without being seen. There was no way they could have hidden in that tiny patch of trees and still stayed out of sight. But they were gone, just like that. I blinked again, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. William started pacing below us, his voice shaky as he spoke under his breath. He was mumbling something I couldn't quite make out, but I didn't need to hear it to know that he was just as freaked out as I was. Stacy reached over and grabbed my arm, her grip tight as she pulled me back to reality. But my mind kept going back to the creatures, to the way they moved, to the way they just disappeared. My heart was racing. The world around us felt like it had shifted somehow, like something deep inside it had been uncovered, and we were all standing on the edge of something we didn't understand. Stacy and I didn't speak. We didn't need to. We both knew what had happened wasn't something we could just brush off. We couldn't just forget about it. Not after seeing that. Not after the way they moved, the way they vanished. We didn't talk as we climbed down from the tree. We didn't speak on the way back to Stacy's house, and neither of us said anything when we got there. We just went inside, sat down, and stared at the door like we were waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Nothing at all. In the days that followed, I found myself constantly thinking about it. Those creatures, those shapes that shouldn't exist, moving through the field with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. Stacy and William were just as haunted by it. We tried to talk about it a few times, but the words felt wrong, like they couldn't fully capture what we had seen. None of us knew how to explain it, and every time we tried, it only made the memory more unsettling. We didn't go out to that field at night anymore. We didn't go near the edge of the field, near the trees, where they had vanished. We stayed away from the dark parts of the field, and for weeks, we didn't even talk about it. But even now, whenever I close my eyes, I can see them, those creatures, running through the field, fast and limber, like something out of a nightmare. Something that didn't belong. There was no answer to what they were or where they went. There were no explanations, no theories, nothing. Just an eerie silence that followed us in the days after. We never spoke about it again. Not because we didn't want to, but because we knew deep down that sometimes it's better not to talk about the things you can't explain. And that was the worst part of it all. Knowing we saw something so strange and terrifying, and having no way to understand it. Ever since I was a baby, my godmother was always there. She was like a second mother to me. My parents trusted her completely, and I did too. She had this calm, comforting presence that made everything feel safe. When I had a fever or a stomachache, she would sit beside me with a damp white towel, whispering quiet prayers that I never quite understood, but they always seemed to work. Sometimes she would place the towel over my forehead and just press gently while murmuring to herself, and within an hour or two, I would feel better. No medicine, no hospital, just her. Her house was right next door to ours, and growing up, I spent a lot of time there. It was a small one-story home with heavy beige curtains and the faint scent of cigarettes and something like lavender. Her kitchen always had a pot on the stove, usually beans or soup, and an old radio on the counter near the sink that was always on. It played the news mostly, but it would randomly lose signal and turn to static before tuning back in again. I didn't think much of it back then. The radio was just part of the atmosphere. I remember how sometimes when I visited, she wouldn't even notice me come in. I'd say hi, but she'd be staring out the window, lips moving. It wasn't mumbling either. It was like she was speaking a real language, just not one I recognized. Other times she would step outside into the backyard and talk into the wind like someone was listening. She never looked upset or angry. It was peaceful, like she was having a conversation that didn't require answers. She never scared me, not once, even when I didn't understand her. I just figured she was different in a way adults sometimes were. But I did start noticing the patterns, like how she always kept a bowl of water in the corner of the kitchen with a white towel folded beside it. How she lit a cigarette with her back turned away from the windows. How she never wore jewelry, except for a small wooden cross she tied around her wrist with yarn instead of a chain. And the humming. She hummed the same melody whenever she cooked, a low, slow tune that repeated over and over. I'd find myself humming it at home without realizing it. I lived with my parents in a 2-story house. My bedroom was upstairs, facing the back of our property. From my window, I could see the edge of her backyard and sometimes even catch a glimpse of her through the trees or hanging laundry. The upstairs of our house was always warmer than the rest of it, especially in the summer. At night, I usually left my window cracked to let in the breeze. One night, I remember feeling off. There wasn't a specific reason, just that weird, nagging sense that something was wrong. Like the air in my room felt heavier. I got into bed and tried to close my eyes, but my brain wouldn't stop thinking. I felt like something was in the room with me, though nothing was out of place. I kept blinking, closing my eyes, and opening them again, hoping to get sleepy, but it didn't help. The silence in the room wasn't really silent either. It felt like it was pressing in on me. That kind of pressure where your ears feel full, like you're underwater. I finally must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember is being in a dream that didn't feel like a dream. In it, I was in her house. Everything looked normal. Same furniture, same smells, same soft yellow light in the kitchen. But she wasn't speaking. She was standing in the hallway near her bedroom, and I started walking toward her. I just wanted to hug her. I missed her. But as I got close, she stepped back, and the hallway stretched longer. I reached again and walked faster, but she moved further away again. No matter how fast I walked, she kept getting smaller and farther until she turned and disappeared into the darkness at the end of the hallway. I tried to call out, but my throat was locked. That's when things shifted. I felt like my body was being lifted off the bed and slammed back down again. Not physically, but inside the dream. My chest started to tighten, and I couldn't breathe properly. My jaw clenched and shook, and suddenly there was this sound coming from me. A low hum, getting louder and louder. It was vibrating my teeth, my skull, everything. I couldn't stop it. I was trapped inside myself. My arms started jerking, my legs too, and it felt like fire was pouring through my muscles. Then came the foaming, thick and bitter, filling my mouth and spilling out. I was choking on it, still humming, still shaking, eyes rolled back but still seeing her, seeing the hallway. I remember trying to reach my hand out one last time, and then everything went dark. I came to when I heard voices. My parents were in the room, panicked, trying to get me to wake up. My mother was holding my face, wiping the foam away, while my dad was yelling something, probably calling 911. I couldn't move at first. Everything was sore. I was soaked with sweat, shirt stuck to my chest, and my legs felt like they'd run a marathon. My hands were clenched into fists. My throat burned. I just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, breathing in short, shallow gasps. I didn't even cry. I couldn't. And then I saw something, or someone, outside the window. She was there, my godmother, standing still, almost like a shadow. She wasn't glowing or floating or anything dramatic. She was just there, looking at me. Not smiling, not sad either, just watching. And then, just as fast as I saw her, she was gone. I blinked, and the window was empty. I was taken to the hospital. They ran a bunch of tests, asked me a lot of questions. They thought it might have been a seizure. They asked if I had a history of epilepsy. I didn't. No one in my family did either. They kept me overnight and monitored me, but nothing else happened. I felt completely fine the next day, aside from being exhausted and confused. The doctors didn't have a solid explanation. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was a one-time thing. Later that afternoon, after we got home, my mom sat down beside me. Her eyes were red, and she looked like she hadn't slept either. She told me gently that my godmother had passed away the morning before. Lung cancer. Apparently, she had kept it quiet, hadn't told anyone how bad it was. She had died in her sleep. I was numb for a while after that. The idea that she died before what happened to me made everything feel even stranger. That night, the humming, the foaming, the dream, it all happened after she was already gone. But the image of her at the window didn't fade. I remembered it clearly. And part of me started wondering whether I really saw her or just wanted to believe she had been there. I didn't talk about it much. I didn't even write it down. But things didn't go back to normal right away. For weeks after her death, I felt watched. Not scared exactly, just observed, like something was evaluating me. Her house sat empty for months. My parents said they were waiting for the extended family to sort out her belongings, but no one seemed in a rush. Eventually someone came and took the furniture. The kitchen radio was gone. The white towels disappeared too. One day I walked over there alone, just to see. The house smelled stale without her in it. The walls looked smaller, the light duller. I walked into the kitchen and stood where the radio used to be. The countertop had a faint ring from a water bowl, like it had been there so long it etched itself into the surface. I touched it with my hand and suddenly remembered the sound of her prayers. Not the words, those I still couldn't understand, but the rhythm, the tone, the calm in her voice. That strange humming returned to my ears, echoing faintly, and I had to step back. I felt dizzy, not afraid, just overwhelmed. I never had another episode like that again. Whatever it was, seizure, stress, hallucination, never repeated. I saw doctors a few more times, and they kept saying the same thing. It could have been anything. Nothing showed up in the scans. No tumors. No epilepsy. Nothing. As I got older, I thought more about who she was. Maybe she wasn't magic in the way people think about it. No spells or potions. But she had something. A way of making things stop hurting. A way of calming storms in the body and the mind. And maybe the strangeness about her, the languages, the rituals, the quiet talking into wind, was her way of managing whatever that power was. Something handed down to her, maybe. Something she didn't even fully understand. But she cared for me. That much I know. She was always gentle, always present, even in the end. I think in whatever way she could, she was trying to protect me. Maybe she knew she was dying. Maybe she tried to say goodbye. Even now, years later, I still sometimes hum that tune she always used in the kitchen. I'll catch myself doing it without thinking, usually when I'm alone and trying to concentrate or calm down. It's become part of me, like her hands on my forehead, like the smell of lavender and cigarettes, like the feeling of comfort in her presence. I don't know if that night was a goodbye or something else, but it stayed with me clear as day. Not supernatural, not imagined, just something real that happened, strange and sharp and unforgettable. And even though I never saw her again, I've never stopped feeling that she's near. Not as a ghost or spirit or anything like that. Just in the way that certain people leave fingerprints on your life. Quiet ones you don't see until years later. I remember her. Not just with my mind, but in the small ways. How I hum when I'm cooking. How I fold towels a certain way. How I pause to listen when the wind moves through the trees. That's where she is. Not in the window. Not in the hallway of a dream. But in the quiet spaces of my life where care lives. Where memory settles. Where healing happens. Even when you don't know why. Growing up, I lived in a small, isolated house deep in the woods. My family had moved there when I was young, and we had very few neighbors. The ones we did have were elderly, all of them well beyond retirement age. Our house was several miles away from the nearest town, and we hardly ever saw anyone else, except for a rare delivery or when we went into town for groceries. Life there was quiet, peaceful, but also lonely in a way I didn't fully understand at the time. I didn't mind the solitude back then. It felt safe, and the trees surrounding our house felt like a natural shield from the outside world. One night, when I was about 9 years old, things took a turn, and I would never see my little world the same again. It was a typical evening. My mom and I were in the house, just the two of us. My dad worked long hours at a job in town, and it was often just me and my mom during the nights. I'd spent most of the evening playing in the living room while my mom read a book in the kitchen. The quiet, familiar hum of the house was soothing. There were no streetlights, no cars driving by, no noises beyond the sounds of the woods, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. I loved the stillness, the way everything seemed to slow down as the night settled in. But that night was different. It started with a sudden, loud pounding at the downstairs door. I had been sitting on the floor, playing with my toys when I first heard it. The sound was jarring, almost violent in its intensity. It shook the house and sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just a knock, it was pounding, steady, rhythmic, and forceful. The sound was so loud it felt as though someone was trying to break the door down. I froze, looking at the door in confusion. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew something wasn't right. It felt like the world outside had suddenly changed. I heard my mom stand up quickly from the kitchen, the floorboards creaking as she hurried to the stairs. Her footsteps were quick, but cautious. She called out to me in a voice that was too calm, too controlled for the situation. "Stay here, honey. Stay upstairs." I didn't move. I didn't want to move. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My mom quickly disappeared down the stairs, and I heard her go toward the door. The pounding didn't stop. It was relentless. I could hear her footsteps again as she went to the peephole, and then, a moment later, she returned upstairs. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She didn't speak at first. I remember looking at her, waiting for some explanation, some sign that it was nothing, just someone making a mistake. But there was nothing like that. Her eyes were filled with something I didn't quite understand. Fear, worry, something deep and unsettling that made me feel cold in a way I had never felt before. She picked up the phone, dialed quickly, and in a low, steady voice, she spoke to the police. I couldn't hear exactly what she was saying, but the tone of her voice told me it was serious. She didn't tell me who was outside or why the door was being pounded on. She just told me to stay in my room and stay quiet. The pounding continued, an endless barrage that seemed to shake the walls. Each thud felt like it might break through. I remember wanting to run downstairs to see what was going on, but something inside me told me not to. Something told me that if I opened that door, I wouldn't like what I found on the other side. I sat in my room, staring at the wall, too scared to move, too scared to do anything but wait. The pounding went on for what felt like hours, but it was probably only about 10 minutes. Then, without warning, it stopped. Just like that. Silence fell over the house, heavy and suffocating. I don't know how much time passed before the police arrived. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. I heard the sirens in the distance, and then the headlights of their patrol car flashed through the windows. My mom had gone downstairs to meet them, and I stayed in my room, too scared to move, too scared to ask what was going on. From where I sat, I could hear muffled voices downstairs. The police were talking to my mom. She explained what had happened, and then they left. Just like that. The door had been pounded on, but no one was there when they arrived. My mom came back upstairs, and the fear in her eyes had faded a little, but I could still sense something lingering. She didn't explain much to me then. She just told me it was one of our neighbors, someone we knew, and that he was confused. The next few days were strange. My mom didn't talk much about it, but I could tell she was worried. The whole thing just didn't sit right with me. Our neighbor, an older man, had been acting strangely recently, but I had no idea it was anything more than that. He'd lived in the house next door for years, and we had always waved to him when we saw him outside. I didn't understand why someone like that would be at our door in the middle of the night, acting like that. It wasn't until much later that I found out the full story. Apparently, our neighbor had been struggling with a brain tumor, something that had been affecting his behavior. He had been wandering around the neighborhood at night, confused and disoriented, sometimes naked, sometimes holding strange things like an axe. My mom didn't want to scare me, so she hadn't told me everything at the time, but I later overheard her talking to someone about it. The man's wife had called the police a few times before, worried about him, but each time they were told he wasn't a threat. He wasn't violent, just confused. The next time he showed up at our door, he didn't have the axe, but he was still naked. My mom handled it the same way she had before. She called the police, and they came, talked to him, and eventually, the man was taken to a hospital. He wasn't dangerous, just sick, but that didn't make it any less terrifying to me. Every time he showed up, I was more afraid. My mom tried to reassure me that nothing would happen, but I didn't believe her. I couldn't. He didn't come back for a while after that, but it wasn't the end of the story. My mom explained later that they had found a way to help him, and he had eventually gotten the treatment he needed. When he recovered, he came by our house, brought us muffins, and apologized for his past behavior. He seemed like a completely different person, normal, friendly. But to me, he was still that man who had pounded on our door in the middle of the night, naked and holding an axe. I didn't trust him anymore. The sound of someone banging on my door still haunted me, and I'd have nightmares about it for weeks after. The nightmares were the worst part. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, my hands sweating, imagining that someone was at the door. It was always the same dream. I was standing there, in front of the door, trying to lock it, but the lock wouldn't work. The banging would get louder, and I would feel like I was about to be torn apart. I'd wake up just as the door would finally burst open, and I'd be left lying there, terrified, unable to shake the feeling of someone being right there with me. Years passed, and I grew up, but the memories of those nights never fully went away. I moved away from the house when I was older, but there was always a part of me that remembered that pounding, that fear, and the confusion of a man who didn't know where he was or what he was doing. And sometimes, even now, I still hear that sound in my dreams, just for a moment, loud, relentless, and terrifying. It wasn't the last time I would deal with something like that, either. As a teenager, I had a job babysitting my nephews one night at my brother's house. He lived in a different part of the woods, far from where I had grown up, but the feeling of isolation was the same. My brother's house had an enclosed front porch, and it was one of those old-fashioned houses with thin doors and windows that you could see right through. I had fallen asleep on the couch, the door between the porch and the outside world just a few feet away from me. It was around 2 a.m. when it happened. The sound came again, but this time it was different. The banging was coming from the house door, not the front door to the porch. Someone was inside the porch, already on the other side of the door, knocking on the thin wooden glass, demanding to be let in. There was no way to stop them. My heart dropped to my stomach, and I froze, staring at the door in horror. A man was out there. He wasn't even trying to hide. I could see him through the glass, his face blurred in the dim light, but his eyes were wild. I told him to leave, but he wouldn't. He just kept demanding to be let in, saying he knew someone inside, someone I didn't know. His voice was slurred, drunk, and aggressive. I felt my chest tighten as I realized I was trapped. There was nowhere to go, no way out. The door was flimsy, the window clear as day, and he could see me, could hear me, could. But then, after what felt like an eternity, the man finally gave up and left, walking away into the night. I didn't move. I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes, watching me waiting. I stood up slowly, went to the door, checked it, made sure it was locked, and then waited, listened to the silence. After that, I sat there wide-eyed, holding my breath until the morning light came. It didn't make sense. What had just happened? Was it just a drunk, or was there something else out there, something more sinister? I didn't know, but I never forgot the feeling of that night. The same feeling I had when I was a kid, back when the pounding on the door had shaken me to my core. That fear, that helplessness, would stay with me for a long time, long after the night had passed. There were always strange people knocking at doors, in one way or another, and I never quite got used to it. But I learned to lock my doors, to stay alert, and to always trust that gut feeling, because sometimes that's all you've got. Back when I was in high school, I spent a lot of weekends at my friend Mary's place. We were both around 16 at the time, and while my home life was calm and steady, hers was complicated. She'd been moved to our small Texas town only a couple months before we became friends. Nobody knew much about her, except that she didn't come from around here. She was quiet, but she had this edge to her, like someone who'd seen too much. And she had. I found out later that she was in the witness protection program. It wasn't something she told everyone. She only told me after we got close. We'd stayed up one night talking in the dark, like girls do, and she suddenly got quiet and said, "You can't ever tell anyone this." She didn't say it dramatically. Her voice was flat, but serious. She told me she'd seen a man kill someone. She didn't give me all the details, just that it happened in her old neighborhood and she'd told the police. There was a trial coming, and until then, she had to be somewhere safe. That place ended up being a trailer out in the country, about 20 minutes from the edge of town. I remember feeling stunned. That kind of thing didn't happen to people like us. It was something you saw on the news or in movies. But there she was, living proof that real life wasn't always as boring and safe as we thought. Mary lived with her mom, who was always working night shifts. I never met her dad, and Mary never talked about him. Her trailer was parked out on a small patch of land, surrounded by brittle grass and a few scraggly trees. No close neighbors, no lights from town, just the empty stretch of road leading to the highway. It felt like the middle of nowhere, and honestly, it creeped me out a little. One Friday night, Mary invited me over for a sleepover. I had to lie to my parents about where I was going, because they wouldn't have let me stay that far out of town with no adults around. I told them I was sleeping at my friend Jessica's house. My mom wasn't strict, but she was the worrying type, and if she'd known the truth about Mary, she never would have let me go. That night started out normal. We went to the movie theater in town and watched a horror movie. I don't remember what it was called, but it was one of those slashers with a killer in a mask, sneaking around in the dark, jumping out from behind things. We laughed through most of it, pretending not to be scared, but I could tell it got to Mary more than she let on. She was jittery the whole drive back, kept glancing in the rearview mirror, like someone might be following us. I didn't say anything, but I felt it too, a weird tension hanging in the air. It was dark when we pulled into her long gravel driveway. Her trailer sat quiet and still, the porch light casting a pale yellow glow that barely touched the yard. The sky above us was thick with stars, and the wind had that dry, late summer bite to it. We got out of the car and carried our snacks and blankets inside. Mary double-checked the locks on the door, which she always did, then pulled the curtains shut and made sure all the windows were locked too. That was her routine every night, she said. She never left a window open, not even a crack. We set up in the living room, dragging her mattress from the bedroom and piling it with blankets. We tried to watch another movie, but the DVD player kept skipping, so we just talked. I don't remember what we talked about. Boys probably. School drama. Normal stuff. But Mary was on edge. She kept pausing and tilting her head, like she thought she heard something outside. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the front door. "Yeah, just nerves from the movie." I tried to lighten the mood, told a dumb story about my little brother peeing his pants when he got scared watching Goosebumps. Mary smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She got up to make popcorn, and that's when we both heard it, the sound of something brushing against the side of the trailer. It was soft at first, just a faint scraping noise, then a thud, then another. We froze. Mary looked at me, her face drained of color. She didn't move for a few seconds, just stood there holding the popcorn bowl like she'd forgotten she had it. "Probably just a raccoon," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice shook. Mary didn't answer. She set the bowl down slowly, then moved to the hallway and turned off all the lights. I followed her without a word. The whole trailer went dark, except for a tiny bit of moonlight slipping through a gap in the curtains. The air felt thick, like the silence was pressing in on us. Then came the banging. Not a raccoon, not a branch in the wind. This was someone pounding on the front door. Hard. Then again bang, 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 like they were trying to break it down. The trailer shook. Literally. The whole frame trembled under the force of the banging. Mary let out a gasp and grabbed my arm. We ran for the bathroom, slamming the door behind us and locking it. She was shaking so bad her teeth were chattering. I pressed my back against the door, trying to hear if the person had gotten inside, but all I could hear was Mary crying and whispering prayers under her breath. She really thought it was them, the people she was hiding from. I'd never seen someone so scared in my life. She was crouched in the corner, arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth. I kept whispering that it was going to be okay, that it was probably a dumb prank or some drunk idiot, but I didn't believe it myself. The trailer kept shaking from the force of the pounding. At some point, I realized I'd wet myself without even noticing. We stayed in that bathroom for what felt like forever. At some point, the banging stopped. Just silence. We waited. I counted my breaths, trying to keep from crying. I could feel Mary's fear in the air. It was like electricity, buzzing in my skin. Eventually, we heard footsteps outside. Then laughter. Not the kind that makes you feel better. This was mean, sharp laughter, like someone who enjoyed scaring us. Mary crept over to the small window and peeked out. Her whole face changed. "It's that bitch from school," she whispered. "Amber." I didn't believe her at first. Who would do something like that? But then I heard Amber's voice yelling something outside. I didn't catch what she said, but it was her. I recognized the smug tone. It was a prank. A sick, cruel prank. Eventually, we came out. There were shoe prints in the dirt outside, and the porch light was hanging by a wire, swinging in the wind. Mary didn't say anything for a long time. She cleaned up, threw our blankets in the wash, and stayed quiet. But something in her had changed. After that night, Mary wasn't the same. She got quieter at school, stopped eating lunch with me. Some days she didn't show up at all. I tried calling her, but she stopped picking up. I went out to the trailer once, but it looked abandoned. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know who to call. Her mom wasn't around. I never saw her again after that night. Then one day, Mary just vanished. It wasn't like she moved away. No one knew anything. Her locker was emptied. Her name disappeared from the attendance list. I asked the school office, but they said she'd transferred. That's all. No explanation. I tried asking around, but no one knew where she'd gone. Not even the teachers. It was like she'd been erased. For years, I kept thinking maybe it was just the program moving her again. Maybe someone got too close, or maybe the trial was starting. But deep down, I wondered if something worse had happened. Mary had started using pills not long after that night. Just little stuff at first, stuff she said helped her sleep, helped her feel calm. But I think it got worse. Her eyes looked dull, her hands always shook, and sometimes she'd zone out like she wasn't really there. My mom, who was the one telling me this story, by the way, because this didn't happen to me, it happened to her, still wonders what really happened to Mary. She never found out, never saw her again. She always says that night in the trailer changed everything. That look on Mary's face in the bathroom, that raw, shaking fear, it stuck with her. She said she never forgot how helpless she felt. She believes something bad happened to Mary. Either the people she was hiding from found her, or she got too deep into the drugs and ran. Either way, she vanished without a trace. And that silence, that not knowing, is what makes the whole thing feel so much worse. It wasn't just the prank that night. It was the fear that the danger was real, that maybe it still is. My mom still dreams about that night sometimes. She said once that in the dream, she's back in that trailer, holding the door shut, and Mary is crying again, whispering her prayers. But this time, the banging never stops. And she always wakes up before she finds out who's really on the other side. About a year ago, I woke up around 1 a.m. with a strange feeling. It wasn't a sound or a nightmare that stirred me, but an overwhelming sense that something was off. My room was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy. I opened my eyes and looked toward the door. There, standing with his back to me, was a tall, shadowy figure. He wore a bowler hat, a long coat that reached his knees, and polished black shoes. He stood still, not moving, just facing the door. I couldn't see his face, and that made it worse. The dim light from the hallway cast just enough glow to outline his silhouette, but not enough to reveal any features. I wanted to move, to sit up or call out, but my body wouldn't respond. It felt like I was glued to the bed, every muscle locked in place. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breathing became shallow. Panic set in, but I couldn't do anything about it. Then, just as suddenly as the fear had gripped me, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. It was like someone had flipped a switch. My eyelids grew heavy, and despite the terror I felt, I drifted back to sleep. About 30 minutes later, I was jolted awake by a voice. My brother was standing beside my bed, his face inches from mine, repeating my name over and over. His eyes were wide open, but there was something off about them. They looked vacant, like he wasn't really seeing me. I pushed him away and turned on the light. He didn't react to the sudden brightness or my attempts to wake him. Then, after a moment, he blinked and seemed to come to. He looked at me and said, "It wasn't me." Confused, I asked, "What wasn't you?" He stared at me with that same vacant look and repeated, "It wasn't me. It was the man." His tone was flat, emotionless. That night, I locked my bedroom door before going back to sleep. I didn't want any more surprises. The next morning at breakfast, I hadn't mentioned anything about the night before. I was still trying to make sense of it myself. Then, out of nowhere, my brother said, "I had the craziest dream last night. There was a man in your room, wearing an old hat and a trench coat." I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth. I hadn't told him anything about what I saw. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started researching sleep disorders and came across something called sleep paralysis. It's a condition where you wake up but can't move, often accompanied by hallucinations. Many people report seeing shadowy figures during these episodes. Very well help. I also looked into my brother's condition. He's had night terrors and sleepwalking episodes since he was a kid. It's not uncommon for people with these conditions to act out their dreams or have vivid hallucinations. I began to wonder if what I saw was a hallucination brought on by sleep paralysis, and if my brother's dream was just a coincidence. But the details were too similar. The hat, the coat, the presence in my room. Wikipedia. I decided to set up a camera in my room, just in case. For weeks, nothing happened. No strange figures, no sleepwalking episodes. I started to relax, thinking maybe it was just a one-time thing. Then one night, I reviewed the footage and saw something that made my blood run cold. Around 1 a.m., the door to my room slowly creaked open. A tall, shadowy figure stepped inside, stood by the door for a moment, then turned and left. I showed the footage to my brother, and he turned pale. He didn't remember anything from that night, but the figure matched the one we both had seen. We decided to seek help. We visited a sleep specialist who explained that our experiences could be linked to sleep disorders. Sleep paralysis and night terrors can cause vivid hallucinations and even physical actions like sleepwalking. With therapy and some lifestyle changes, my brother's episodes became less frequent. I haven't experienced sleep paralysis since. Looking back, I realized that our minds can play tricks on us, especially when we're vulnerable. The figure we saw was likely a manifestation of our subconscious fears, brought on by our sleep disorders. It's a reminder of how powerful the human mind can be, and how important it is to take care of our mental and physical health. When I was around 12, I used to spend a lot of time at my friend Mark's house. We were both in middle school, into cartoons, video games, and whatever random hobbies kids get obsessed with. At the time, I was big into Ninja Turtles, collecting the little action figures and pretending I was one of them when we played outside. Mark lived a few streets over, and his place was old, one of the oldest houses in that part of town. You could see it in the siding, hear it in the way the stairs creaked when you walked up or down them. Even the smell of the house was different, like dust and wood and something else I couldn't explain. His parents were always nice, but they worked evenings a lot, especially on weekends. His dad was a manager at some kind of local factory, and his mom worked retail. Maybe at a clothing store, I don't remember now. All I know is that most nights, especially Friday or Saturday, it was just Mark and me in that house. The first time I stayed over, I noticed something weird about him. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, just something I chalked up to people having different routines. He had a bedroom down in the basement, his choice apparently, and his parents were fine with it. It was a finished basement, but not the fancy kind. The carpet was old and gray, the walls were plain and painted beige, and everything down there felt darker than it needed to be, even with all the lights on. His room was off to the side, tucked between a weird little storage area and the boiler room. Mark always acted normal when I got there. We'd play Nintendo, watch cartoons, eat junk food. His parents would usually head out around 7 or 8, saying goodbye before they left. But once it started getting late, after 10 or so, he'd get quiet. Not scared exactly, but just different. I'd suggest we keep playing, or watch a movie or something, but he'd always shake his head and say we should just go to sleep. He didn't explain why. He didn't seem scared of anything specific. It was more like he just didn't want to be awake past a certain point. We'd go into his room, which barely fit 2 people. He had a twin bed against the wall, a beat-up dresser, and a tiny nightstand with a clock on it. I'd usually sleep in a sleeping bag on the floor. We turned off all the lights, and that was it. No talking, just lying there in the dark. It happened during my 3rd or 4th sleepover there, a Saturday night, early spring. I remember because I'd gotten in trouble the weekend before and had been grounded, so this was my first night back at his place after a couple of weeks. I'd brought over a bunch of Ninja Turtle toys, and we'd spent the afternoon outside in his backyard, building a little fort out of sticks and cardboard boxes. It was one of those chilly evenings where the sky stays just a little too gray, like it's not sure whether it wants to rain or not. His parents left just after 8, and we ate mac and cheese from a box for dinner. By 10:30, Mark started getting that look again, the quiet one. I was still wide awake and didn't want to go to bed yet, but he told me we should go downstairs and get ready. I didn't push it. We got into his room, turned out the lights, and laid down. He was on the bed, like always, and I was in the sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling board. I didn't have a phone or anything back then. I just lay there thinking about the next Ninja Turtle I wanted to get for my collection. It couldn't have been more than 20 minutes later when I noticed something. Light, very faint at first, started creeping in under the door. Just a soft glow. My first thought was that his parents were back early. Maybe they'd decided to pick up some takeout or forgot something and came back. Then music started playing. Something low and kind of scratchy, like it was coming from a stereo with a busted speaker. I couldn't tell the song, but it sounded old, like music adults listened to when they wanted to relax. Jazz maybe, or something with a lot of piano and saxophone. I didn't say anything. Mark hadn't moved, so I figured he was either asleep or pretending to be. I kept looking at the bottom of the door. From where I was lying, I could see just a sliver of the floor outside. Then I saw the boots. They moved across the light, slow and steady. Heavy boots, not the kind you'd wear around the house. Work boots, thick and scuffed up. I could hear them too, dull thuds on the basement floor, like whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet. They walked past the door once, then again, then back the other way. It went on for what felt like forever. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe more. At one point, I shifted a little and accidentally made the sleeping bag rustle. The boots stopped moving. They just stopped. I didn't move again after that. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything shut off. The music cut. The lights went out. The basement went back to complete silence. I lay there frozen, breathing through my nose as quietly as I could. My heart was racing. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it really was his parents. Maybe they came back for something, played some music, and left again. But I hadn't heard the door open or close. I hadn't heard footsteps going up the stairs. And that music had sounded like it came from right outside the door. A few minutes later, maybe 5 or 10, I heard the front door upstairs open. Clear this time, loud and unmistakable. It shut again, and I could hear someone setting down bags, voices talking, footsteps above us. The normal sounds of people coming home. I didn't say anything to Mark. Not that night. I was still trying to make sense of it. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is sunlight coming through the tiny window near the ceiling, the one that looked out to the side yard. The house felt normal again. At breakfast, I asked his parents if they'd come home earlier in the night, maybe played some music or something. They looked confused and said no. They'd only just gotten back a little after midnight. That's when I realized it hadn't been them. I wanted to believe there was some explanation. Maybe a neighbor had been in the basement for some reason. Maybe there was an old stereo with a timer or something strange like that. But I never saw any stereo down there, and the only entrance to the basement was through the stairs inside the house. Mark didn't bring it up. I think he knew. Maybe that's why he always wanted to go to bed early. Maybe he didn't want to see whatever that was again. I only stayed at his house one more time after that. Nothing happened that night, but I couldn't relax. I kept waiting for the lights to come on, for that music to start again, for those boots to walk past the door. When it didn't happen, I was relieved, but I didn't want to push my luck. Years later, I drove by that old house. Mark had moved away by then. The house looked the same siding, same yard, same cracked steps leading up to the front door. I thought about knocking, maybe asking the new owners if they ever noticed anything strange, but I didn't. I figured it wouldn't change anything. I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe someone had a key. Maybe there was a squatter or someone using the basement when no one was home. It wouldn't be the first time something like that happened in a neighborhood like ours. People quietly breaking in, living in crawl spaces or garages without anyone knowing. It's not the kind of thing you think about when you're a kid, but it happens. I don't believe in ghosts. Never have. But I do believe in people doing weird, dangerous things when they think no one's watching. And I think Mark had figured that out a long time before I did. That basement, that night, it was the first time I ever felt like I wasn't alone in a room, even when no one was supposed to be there. And I've never forgotten it. We'd been talking about it for weeks. It started as a group chat conversation, a kind of vague wish that we could all meet up again like we used to. After school ended and we all scattered in different directions. Uni work, just life, we didn't see each other as much anymore. We used to be close, one of those school friend groups who knew everything about each other. We'd spent years growing up together, bus rides in the dark to and from school across the countryside, weekend sleepovers, house parties, all of it. But once we left sixth form, things changed. Everyone was further apart now. Some of us still lived at home, some had moved to cities, others had jobs that kept them busy. But New Year's felt like a good excuse to fix that. We found this cottage on a rental site. It was old, but charming in that overly polished way that made it clear someone was trying to make it look rustic and cozy for tourists. It used to be a vicarage. The photos showed thick stone walls, a narrow gravel driveway, and lead glass windows that looked out onto a tiny village. The listing mentioned that it was beside a church, which seemed weirdly fitting for New Year's somehow, like we were beginning the year somewhere peaceful and proper. But the bit that stuck out to me was that to get to the front door of the cottage, you had to walk through the churchyard, through the edge of the cemetery. I don't know why none of us clocked that as an issue. We all arrived in two groups. My car got there first. It was me, Dan, Chloe, and Jamie. We parked just outside the lich gate and had to carry our bags through the gravel path that wound through leaning headstones. It wasn't scary, not really. The sun had just gone down and the cold air had that sharp feel that only winter has. We were all in good spirits, excited to see each other. Chloe joked about the gravestones, reading the names out loud and pretending to be spooked. I laughed with her. None of it felt serious. The cottage looked like something out of a postcard. There were little lights strung up under the eaves. The windows had thick curtains pulled tight, and smoke was already puffing gently out of the chimney. It had been cleaned and prepped for our stay. Warm, quiet, and exactly what we'd wanted. Inside, it was all low ceilings and creaky floorboards. The kind of place where you felt like you had to duck every time you went through a doorway. But it was warm and smelled like firewood and pine cleaner. Someone had left a welcome basket on the kitchen table with a bottle of Prosecco, some biscuits, and a handwritten note with the Wi-Fi code. The second car arrived not long after. Emily, Tasha, Mike, and Sarah. We hugged, laughed, passed around drinks, and started picking out bedrooms. There were 4 upstairs, 2 bigger ones and 2 smaller. Emily and Tasha claimed the room at the end of the hall first, and then people started unpacking and sorting out sleeping arrangements. I wandered downstairs and started pouring drinks. I just opened the Prosecco when I heard something slam upstairs. It was quick, followed by heavy, fast footsteps across the ceiling. Then the kind of sound that makes everyone freeze, someone shouting. Not a normal shout either. A panicked, cracked sound, rising fast. A scream. By the time I got upstairs, most of us were already in the hallway. Emily was crouched in the corner of the smaller room, her hands over her ears, sobbing hard. Her chest was heaving. Tasha was already trying to calm her down, but it was clear she was in shock. Her eyes were wide, her whole body shaking. It took a few minutes to get her to stand, to move. We carried her down to the kitchen and got her sitting in one of the chairs near the radiator. Dan found a blanket. I made her a cup of tea with trembling hands, more for something to do than because I thought it would help. She didn't say much at first. She kept shaking her head, mumbling no, over and over. She didn't want to be touched. She didn't want to explain. Finally, though, she managed to get it out. She said she'd been unpacking on the floor, sitting by her suitcase near the foot of the bed. She looked up, and there was an old woman in the corner across from her, cross-legged, just sitting, not wearing anything weird, just regular old person clothes. But she didn't belong there. Emily said the woman didn't speak, didn't move at first. She just sat and stared. Then, when Emily jumped and gasped, the woman had apparently leaned forward slightly and snarled at her. Not a yell, not a growl. A snarl. Teeth bared, lips curled. Not animalistic, but angry. Personal. Malicious. I think the moment she said the word snarl was when I stopped feeling drunk. The kitchen felt colder, quieter. I remember looking over at Jamie and seeing that he'd gone pale too. Something about that word felt wrong in the air. Snarl. You don't use that word unless it's bad. Unless something actually made your skin crawl. Emily refused to go back upstairs. She refused to even be in the cottage. She said she was going to get a taxi, go home, anything. We tried to calm her down, tell her it was late, freezing, and probably just her mind playing tricks on her. But she wouldn't listen. She didn't even want to wait. Eventually, Dan offered to pack her things for her and called a local taxi service. I waited with her by the front door. She was still shaking. I asked her if she wanted to talk about it more, and she just shook her head. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She kept glancing back up the stairs. The taxi took nearly 40 minutes to arrive. When it did, she barely said goodbye. She was gone just like that. We were all quiet for a long while after that. Eventually, though, the mood shifted again. Someone put music on, drinks were poured, and the party picked up a bit. That's the thing with a group that's been friends a long time. We can recover from weirdness pretty fast. It wasn't that we didn't believe her, but we didn't want to ruin the whole trip over something no one else had seen. The rest of the night was normal. Drinks, games, loud laughter, snacks. At midnight, we gathered in the little sitting room by the fireplace and counted down. It felt good, familiar. Afterward, we bundled up and walked out into the garden behind the house to watch some fireworks going off in the distance over the next village. You could see your breath, and the air was so still it felt like time had stopped. A good kind of quiet, but I didn't sleep well. I was in the room next to the one Emily had fled from. At first, it didn't bother me. I'd had enough to drink that I thought I'd pass out quickly, but I kept hearing things. The walls in that house were thin. You could hear floorboards creaking from the slightest movement. I kept thinking I heard footsteps on the landing, but every time I sat up to listen, there was nothing. I got up once to check the hallway. Nothing. Just darkness, the edge of a red rug catching the light from the bathroom nightlight. The next morning, I was one of the first awake. The kitchen was still messy from the night before, and the house was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. I decided to make tea. While the kettle boiled, I stood near the window looking out over the cemetery. The frost had settled thick overnight, and the gravestones all looked like they'd been dusted with sugar. I thought about Emily, wondered if she'd made it home okay. I picked up my phone to message her, but put it down again. It felt wrong somehow. I didn't want to bring it back up. By midday, we'd all packed and cleaned. We didn't talk about the night much. No one mentioned Emily again. It was like we'd all silently agreed to forget about it. But here's the thing. A few weeks later, I was on the phone with Chloe. Just catching up, nothing serious. She said something in passing about that night, how weird it was, what happened with Emily. Then she paused and said, "You know, I didn't want to say anything at the time, but I felt like someone was standing behind me when I was brushing my teeth that night." I didn't say anything for a second. She went on. She said she'd been in the upstairs bathroom, the one at the end of the hall, and just felt it, like someone was there. She didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything, but the air changed. She got goosebumps all over and left the light on when she went to bed. I hadn't told anyone else this before, but I'd felt something too. Not a vision, not a ghost, just a pressure, like someone watching me, like something that didn't want us there. It was subtle, but real. A few months after that, I looked up the cottage again. I was curious, I don't know why. The listing was still there, but the reviews had been turned off. I found an older version of the page cached online though, and there was one review that stuck out. It was written 2 years earlier. The person said they loved the location but wouldn't stay again, that their daughter had a panic attack the first night, refused to sleep in the bedroom with the window overlooking the church, said she saw someone sitting on the floor. I didn't send the link to anyone. I didn't want to start it all back up again. I haven't been back to that village. No one ever brought the trip up again, not really. Emily doesn't reply when we mention it in the group chat. I saw her once at a pub a few months after. We made eye contact, and she smiled, but it was tight, brief. She left not long after. I don't think anything haunted that cottage. I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe some places carry weight. People lived and died there, worked and suffered and prayed. A church, a vicarage, a graveyard, they've seen too much. Something old lingers in the air, in the walls. Maybe it doesn't want to be seen. Maybe it just wants to be left alone. We were strangers in someone else's space. And maybe, just maybe, someone didn't like that. It was the winter of 1997. Chicago was buried in ice. That year had some of the worst storms I've ever experienced. Power lines went down like they were made of paper, and the cold just settled in and didn't let go. I was 6 years old, and we had just moved into a house that was half finished, literally. One part was old, decades old, full of cracks and creaks and strange smells, while the other was new construction my parents had started not long before we moved in. The new part was modern, brighter, more open, but even with the paint barely dry, the feeling in that house was never quite right. Back then, I didn't understand it. I was just a kid. I knew the house felt weird. I knew I didn't like being alone upstairs, but I had no real words for it. I was too young to know what bad energy meant. Too young to ask questions about the man who used to live there. The man who, as I learned years later, went completely insane and was institutionalized, leaving the house to rot in foreclosure. My parents didn't know the full story when they bought it, but over time, little things started to surface. The night that changed everything for me, my first real experience with what I've come to call the other side, started during one of those brutal power outages. The power had gone out earlier that day, and my parents were downstairs, building a fire to keep the house warm. I remember the smell of smoke and cold air mixing, that faint scent of wood burning in snow. The house was completely quiet apart from the occasional groan of wood under pressure, or the distant whistle of wind slipping through some crack in the walls. I had taken a quick shower in the master bathroom, which was on the opposite side of the hallway from my room. The hallway formed a T-shape, with our bedrooms on one end and the rest of the house extending out in the other direction. It was long, narrow, and dark, the kind of hallway that felt longer at night than it did in the day. After the shower, I realized I'd left my pajamas in my room. I wrapped myself in a towel and ran barefoot across the cold floor, back to my room. The air upstairs felt colder than it should have been, colder than the rest of the house. I chalked it up to the heat not reaching that part of the house yet. I dried off and started putting on my pajamas. That's when I heard it, soft, high-pitched. A giggle, like a kid trying to hold in laughter. I froze. It didn't sound like it came from the hall. It sounded like it came from my room. My closet, maybe. Or right behind me. I turned slowly, my body tight with fear. Nothing was there. Just my half-open closet door, casting a long shadow across the room. My heart was thudding. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the house creaking, or something outside. Then I heard it again. A giggle. This time it was clearer, more deliberate. It came from the direction of the door. When I turned toward it, I saw something slide into view. From behind the door, out came a figure, A child, I think. About my size. But not right. Everything about it was off. It was black, not just dark, but completely black. Not like a shadow, not like a person in dark clothes, but something else. Like the space it took up had no light. Like it didn't reflect anything. It didn't say anything. It just giggled and started walking toward me. Slowly. Not in a rush. I could feel something off in my chest, like a deep instinct screaming that this thing didn't belong. That it wasn't human. I said something. I don't know exactly what. Something like, "You're not supposed to be here." I didn't know what else to say. I could feel the air change. Heavier. Still cold. I stepped back, but it kept coming. When it got close, maybe a foot away, I kicked out. My foot went straight through it, like it was smoke, or air. But the cold on my skin where it passed through was real. It was sharp, like stepping into a freezer. I screamed. Loud. My whole body panicked. I didn't look back. I bolted out of that room, down the stairs, straight to where my parents were. That was the first time I saw him. I started calling him the Black Thing. Not the most creative name, but I was 6, and it fit. Over the next few months, I started seeing him more. Always at night. Always in my room, or near it. Sometimes just standing at the foot of my bed. Sometimes behind my door. I'd see his shape, just standing there, not moving, but I could feel him watching. One summer night, I remember waking up cold. It made no sense. It was July. The air should have been stuffy. But I was freezing, like the heat had been sucked out of the room. I was sleeping in my parents' bed because I couldn't handle my own room anymore. Something had been watching me too often. I rolled over, hoping to get warm, and that's when I saw them. 3 of them, standing at the foot of the bed, not moving. The Black Thing was in the middle. On either side of him, taller, thinner figures. Still completely black. No details. No faces. No clothes. Just shapes, all of them as black as night, standing there. Watching. It wasn't a dream. I was awake. I could feel my own breath shaking. I didn't scream. I didn't even move. But in my head, I told them to leave. Over and over again. I was too scared to speak, but I kept thinking it. Go away. You're not welcome here. And slowly they faded. Like smoke. The room got warmer. I remember finally breathing again, and sometime after that, I must have fallen asleep. I didn't see the mother again after that, but I saw the father once more. At the next house we moved to, years later. I was older by then, maybe 12. We had just moved in, and I was getting used to my new room. I remember opening the closet, and there he was. Not in the closet, just standing in the middle of the room. Same shape, same black figure. I said nothing out loud, but I stared him down and thought it again. You don't belong here. Get out. And like before, he faded. The new house didn't have the same feeling as the old one. It was brighter, more open, less claustrophobic. But that didn't mean the experiences stopped. My mom and I were different. That's something I didn't understand until much later. There's this story on my mom's side, that someone generations back was a white witch. Greek Orthodox, yes, but with that old country kind of connection to things people don't talk about much. My mom dreams of her parents a lot, and in those dreams they ask about me. They worry, I think. Not that she tells me everything, but I know. She doesn't sleep much. A few hours a night, tops. And when something's off, she knows. One night, years later, she woke me up walking through the house, praying in Greek, tossing incense into corners. That wasn't normal for her. She only did it when things were bad, when the house felt wrong. I could smell it. The incense. It always reminded me of church, which somehow made it worse. She told me later her parents came to her in a dream and told her to wake up, that something evil was in the house. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. I felt it too, like something heavy was sitting on my chest. I didn't see anything that time, but the air was thick, the silence sharp. I knew better than to pretend it was nothing. Then came Rome. That was the most recent time something happened. It was supposed to be a celebration, college graduation, a trip with my parents, a return to a hotel we had stayed at before. Nothing fancy, but it had memories. The first few days were normal. Sightseeing, food, walking until our legs gave out. One night, I woke up feeling like I'd been dumped into a bathtub full of ice water. My skin was cold. My bones ached. The kind of cold that doesn't make sense when the air conditioner isn't even on. I didn't want to open my eyes. I already knew, but I did it anyway. Floating above the floor, 6 feet off the ground, was a shape. A creature, maybe. I don't know what else to call it. Not a person, not even a shadow. It was like a black cloud, but longer, like a snake or a ribbon, with no clear beginning or end. It hovered in the middle of the room, perfectly still. It wasn't looking at me. It was looking at my mom, and she was looking back. Neither of us moved. Neither of us said anything. The thing didn't do anything. It just existed there, heavy and cold and watching. At some point, I must have passed out, or fallen asleep. I don't remember closing my eyes, but I woke up to morning light and warm air and the normal sounds of a hotel waking up. Later that morning, my mom and I stepped outside to smoke. We stood there in silence for a bit before I asked her about it. She didn't say much, but I could tell it had shaken her too. She told me we were going to the Vatican that day. No plan, no discussion. She just said we were going. I didn't argue. We walked the grounds, we paid our respects, not out of religious duty, but out of instinct, out of self-preservation. Nothing happened after that. The rest of the trip was fine, quiet. We haven't talked about it much since. I've spent most of my life walking that line, between normal and not, between what people accept and what they ignore. I don't think what I've seen is supernatural in the way people think. I don't think it's ghosts or demons or anything like that. I think it's something else, something older, something that's always been there, just outside of what we can explain. And I don't look for it. I never go chasing it. But sometimes it finds me. That's the part that scares me the most. I was about 10 years old when my auntie told me this story. It wasn't the scariest story I'd ever heard, but it stuck with me. It wasn't a ghost story or some wild tale of monsters in the woods. It was just unsettling, something that made me think twice whenever I was out in the quiet, alone, or in the middle of nowhere. She'd been talking about a trip she and my uncle had taken, a camping holiday in New Zealand. They traveled all over, but this particular trip had something odd about it, something she still couldn't quite explain. I remember her telling me how they'd rented a camper van, one of those old, rugged ones that were just big enough for a small bed, a little kitchen, and a bathroom if you were lucky. It was perfect for a road trip, no schedule, just freedom. They had been on the road for a while, following winding roads through lush hills and farmland, nothing but green for miles. They weren't the type to plan everything down to the minute. They'd make stops where they felt like it, camp wherever looked good, and just enjoy the scenery. One day, they ended up deep in the heart of New Zealand's countryside. My auntie didn't remember how exactly, but somehow, they found themselves parked up in a wide open field. She said it was so isolated, they couldn't see another building or road in sight. Just endless, rolling hills and a few distant trees dotting the landscape. It was peaceful at first, that kind of quiet you only get in the most remote places. The sort of quiet where, if you listened hard enough, you could hear the pulse of your own heartbeat. And that's how it felt, alone, completely cut off from the rest of the world. They decided to stay the night, so they got into bed in the camper van and tried to sleep. My auntie had always been a heavy sleeper, so it wasn't long before she drifted off. But Uncle, the tough guy with muscles who didn't scare easily, he was different. He kept tossing and turning, not quite able to get comfortable. He would tell her later that he felt uneasy, but couldn't quite explain why. Like something was off in the air, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Hours went by, and at some point, they both fell into a deep sleep. That's when it started. My auntie woke up to a faint, rhythmic tapping on the side of the van. It was soft at first, but then it became more distinct. Tap, 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 tap. She said it wasn't like the sound of wind or branches brushing against the van. It was human. It wasn't random either. It was almost like someone was knocking out a rhythm, something deliberate, like a slow, almost musical tapping. She told me it sounded like someone was tapping the tune of a song, maybe something that was barely familiar, but not quite. She laid there, eyes wide open, listening to it. She didn't know what it was, but the noise was so clear and steady. Tap, 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 tap. It was coming from the side of the van, not the roof, not the windows. She could tell it was from the side, like someone was gently tapping their fingers against the metal. Her mind raced, trying to think of a logical explanation. Could it be animals? Maybe a bird or something. But no, the sound was far too consistent, too deliberate. She turned to Uncle, nudging him awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He sat up immediately, wide-eyed, and nodded. He didn't need to hear it again. My auntie said there was something about the way the sound, didn't stop that made her skin crawl. She was used to nature sounds, animals at night, the wind rustling in the trees, but this wasn't that. This was something different. My uncle, being the strong, calm one, started to feel a sense of unease too. He told her that he thought it was just some animal, maybe a bird or a possum or something harmless, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. They stayed in silence for a while, both listening to the tapping, neither of them able to move. And then, just when they thought it couldn't get worse, it did. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, they began to hear what sounded like bongo drums. At first, it was quiet, so quiet that it could have been mistaken for the wind or some kind of distant noise that didn't matter. But as it went on, the sound grew more distinct, clearer, and harder to ignore. Bongo drums, deep and rhythmic, beating in the distance. It wasn't a sound you would expect to hear in the middle of nowhere. Bongo drums didn't fit with the soft rustling of grass or the chirping of distant birds. It was alien, out of place. The noise made both of them stiffen in bed, my auntie told me. She said that feeling of something being just wrong, so wrong, made it hard to breathe. They couldn't see anything outside. The camper van's curtains were drawn, blocking their view. So all they could do was listen. They lay there for what felt like hours, the tapping continuing, the bongo drums faint but steady, the two sounds intertwining in the night. Neither of them moved. Neither of them wanted to get out and see what it was. It wasn't that they thought they'd see something supernatural. Nothing like that. It was the uncertainty, the not knowing. Something was out there, and it was just wrong. My auntie said it wasn't until the drums stopped that they felt the tension ease, just a little. The tapping, too, had stopped at some point during the night. They didn't know when. It was as though the sounds had just disappeared as quickly as they'd come. They didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Neither of them. They just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night around them, their ears strained for anything out of the ordinary. Morning eventually came, though it felt like it had taken forever to arrive. As soon as there was enough light, they both scrambled out of the van. My auntie said she was almost desperate to find some explanation, something that could make sense of the horrible sounds they'd heard. They expected to find a branch or a tree limb that could have tapped the side of the van, something that could explain the rhythmic knocking. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing. The field stretched out around them, flat and wide, no trees or branches close enough to make that noise. In the distance, there were a few scattered trees, but they were far, far away. The grass was tall, but there were no signs of anything being near the van. No footprints, no broken twigs, no signs that anything had been there at all. My auntie said she stood there, confused, trying to make sense of the whole thing. How could there have been such a clear tapping, such a distinct sound, and yet nothing was there? The silence that followed felt louder than the tapping ever had. My uncle, usually the one who was calm in the face of anything, was quiet. He didn't say much. But when they got back into the van to leave, he started the engine, glanced around, and just drove off, never looking back. He didn't want to talk about it. Neither of them did. The bongo drums, the tapping, it was just too strange to explain. Maybe they had both imagined it, or maybe, just maybe, something out there in that field knew they were there. Something that had no explanation, no reason, no rhyme. But whatever it wasn't something they would ever forget. I asked my auntie once, years later, if they ever went back to that place. She shook her head. No. She said they'd passed through the area a couple of times since, but never stopped again. And every time, she swore she could still hear the faint sound of drums in the distance. Not loud, not obvious, but enough to make her wonder if they'd ever really left that field. I don't know what it was that happened to them, and honestly, I don't know if I want to find out. Some things, she told me, are better left unknown. And every time I'm out in the middle of nowhere, in the quiet, I remember that story, and I wonder what's out there, just beyond the edge of the field, tapping, waiting. I didn't experience either of these things myself, but the people who told me about them were not the kind to make things up. No reason to lie. No drama, no flair for the mysterious, just regular people who happened to live through some unsettling things. I used to think back on both stories often, especially when I was alone or lying awake in a quiet house. It wasn't fear, exactly, that stuck with me. It was more like unease that settled into my bones every time I remembered the way they had told me. The way their eyes had moved when they talked about it. How serious they looked even when they tried to laugh it off. The first came from a friend I had growing up. We weren't close anymore. We'd lost touch after high school like most people do. But I still remember the layout of her townhouse. It was one of those tight, packed-together clusters that developers shove into whatever land they can find. I knew the general area. On the surface, it looked like every other suburb. Concrete sidewalks, young trees, rows of identical homes. But underneath it, before any of the digging and paving and construction, the land had a different history. Supposedly, it had once been a burial ground or sacred land tied to native people. That part was always talked about in half-whispers growing up, the kind of thing you hear from a kid's older brother or a neighbor who liked telling scary stories. No one really knew the full details, but there were enough pieces floating around to suggest there was some truth to it. Construction crews had unearthed things during the first phase of building, bones, maybe, or artifacts, but everything was quickly covered up. That was the rumor anyway. My friend's townhouse sat on one of the inner lots. Not the end unit, but close. Her bedroom window faced a small patch of trees that hadn't been cleared. Just a handful of skinny trunks and brush, barely enough to block the view of the next row of houses. It looked ordinary. Nothing about her place seemed off, not at first. But things had started happening over time, small at first. Items going missing. Shoes moved to different spots. Her house keys vanished for a day, only to be found in the freezer. Things like that. She said she used to wake up early sometimes, just before sunrise, and hear what sounded like footsteps. Light, deliberate steps just outside her bedroom door or down the hallway. But when she checked, no one would be there. Her parents were asleep, her siblings weren't home. She tried to ignore it, blamed it on the house settling or the neighbors next door. Then came the renovations. Her parents decided to gut the downstairs bathroom and update the kitchen. Nothing huge, just the kind of things people do after a few years of living in a place. But almost right away, the weird activity spiked. She told me the house felt different during that time, heavier maybe. She felt watched. She started waking up feeling like someone had been in the room with her, even though nothing was ever touched. Sometimes her lights would flicker. The microwave would reset its clock for no reason. Her mom's phone charger would stop working in the wall, but function fine in another outlet. The part that stuck with me most came later in the year, during winter. One morning, she woke up and saw something on her bedroom window. At first, she thought it was just frost. The glass had fogged up during the night, and the cold had formed one of those thin, delicate frost layers over the pane. But when she got closer, she realized it wasn't random. There was a face, not just a smudge or a vague outline, an actual side profile face, detailed enough that you could see the veins in the eyes, the shape of the brow bone, the slope of the nose, the hairline long swept back. You could even make out the feather-like pattern around the temple, like someone had worn something ornamental or symbolic. It wasn't drawn with a finger. It wasn't from breathing on the glass. The frost itself had formed the shape. Every line, every feature, was made from the way the crystals had settled. She took a picture. I remember seeing it. We were maybe 15 or 16. She showed it to me on her phone. I stared at it for minutes, trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like something a person could fake. It was too intricate, too clean, like a stencil had been placed between the glass and the cold night air. And it was unmistakably Native American in appearance, the kind of face you see in history books or carved into monuments. I never saw anything like it again. She said it melted by mid-morning, and the glass went back to normal. But she never slept comfortably in that room again. Her parents wrote it off as a coincidence, maybe something from condensation. Maybe the result of some residue on the glass reacting to the cold. But we both knew better. She moved out a couple years later when her family bought a new place. She didn't take the picture with her. Her phone eventually died, and the file was lost. The other story came from a girl I used to talk to online. We weren't close either, more like acquaintances. We chatted off and on for a while, but things faded naturally. She lived in a different city, a few hours away, and we never met in person. But she told me something once that hit me hard and stayed in the back of my mind for a long time. She used to see a man, not in a dream, but like an imprint that would appear in the corners of her vision or sometimes in reflections. A bald man, pale, thin-looking, never moved much, but he was always there, watching, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, always silent. It sounded like the classic stories you hear from people who claim they're haunted, but there was something different about how she explained it. She didn't try to convince me. In fact, she was kind of embarrassed to admit it. She started having sleep paralysis. At least, that's what it sounded like to me. She'd wake up frozen, unable to move or breathe fully, and feel like she was being strangled. Not with hands, but pressure. A crushing weight around her neck. And every time it happened, she'd see that same figure in the room with her. Not standing over her, but off to the side, by the wall, or by the closet, sometimes just at the foot of her bed. She told me once that she saw the man's reflection in her second-story window. Not just a shadow, his actual outline, clear and defined, even though nothing was behind her. It was night. No lights. No tricks of glare. Just his shape staring back at her from the glass while she stood in the room alone. The faucets in her house started turning on by themselves. Full blast. Water spraying into the sink or the bathtub for no reason. Her parents thought it was a plumbing issue at first, but nothing ever showed up in inspections. She started keeping the bathroom door shut at night. I asked her, just casually, half as a joke, if she'd ever used a Ouija board. She said yes. Once. At a party. Nothing serious, just fooling around with friends. They asked the usual questions. Names, dates, if anything was there. They didn't get any clear answers. It was more of a laugh than anything serious. But she said the weird things started not long after that. I don't know what I believe about Ouija boards or spiritual stuff, but I know people invite in things they don't understand all the time, and sometimes it sticks. I don't think she made any of it up. She didn't seem like the type. She stopped talking about it after a while. I think it scared her to even bring it up. Both stories lingered with me. Different people, different places, but the same feeling. Like something had crossed a line somewhere. Like there were boundaries that had been ignored, and the consequences weren't dramatic or theatrical. They were slow, quiet, and deeply unsettling. I try to rationalize it. The frost on the window could have been a trick of light, a mix of temperature and moisture and pressure. The image could have formed from some natural pattern on the glass, enhanced by the mind's tendency to recognize faces in random shapes. The sleep paralysis, that's a medical thing. Happens to a lot of people. The figure she saw could have been a hypnopompic hallucination, something the brain creates when it's stuck between sleep and waking. The faucets turning on could have been faulty valves, bad seals, pressure issues. But even when I list out all those explanations, I still feel uneasy. Not because I'm afraid of ghosts or the paranormal, but because sometimes, even when you explain everything, it doesn't make the feeling go away. The cold heaviness. The instinct that something is just off. I think that's what scares me more than anything. The possibility that even if nothing paranormal happened, people can still be affected. Their homes, their sleep, their sense of peace. My friend who saw the face in the frost moved away and never mentioned it again. The girl with the sleep paralysis stopped replying to my messages after a while. Life moved on. The world didn't end. But those stories stuck with me like splinters under the skin. And every now and then, when I'm walking past a cold window or brushing my teeth at night and catch something in the mirror behind me, I remember. And I check again, just to be sure. We'd only been in the house for a few weeks when it started. At first, it seemed like nothing more than odd coincidences. Small things that could be explained away. A flickering light here, a strange noise there, and all of it happening in the dead of night. My wife and her old roommate, Sarah, had moved in together, thinking it was going to be a great place. A fresh start, a cozy little spot just big enough for the two of them. It was an older house, one of those charming homes with creaky floors and slightly uneven windows. The kind you might see in a movie, with ivy growing up the sides and an old porch swing out front. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. Or at least, it was supposed to be. The trouble began around the time they had gotten settled in. It started slowly. At first, they thought it was just old wiring or some plumbing issue. Nothing to be alarmed about, or so they thought. But the flickering lights became more predictable. It wasn't random. It would happen at precisely 9 p.m. every night. My wife, Claire, would sit at the kitchen table, working on her assignments or reading, and suddenly, the overhead lights would begin to dim. They wouldn't flicker once or twice, but the bulbs would go completely out for a moment before coming back on, like someone was flicking a switch somewhere. And every time, without fail, it would happen at exactly the same time, 9 p.m. The strange noises started not long after. It would be around 3 a.m., when the house was still and silent, and they'd hear it. The door handles would jiggle. It wasn't just the wind either. The kind of subtle, rhythmic jiggling that made you think someone was standing on the other side, trying to get in. Sometimes it would be just one handle, sometimes two, as if something or someone was walking through the hallways, checking every door. The first time it happened, Sarah had gotten up to investigate. She was the more skeptical of the two, always making excuses for the little things. "It's just the house settling," she'd say, her voice shaky. But after the third night in a row, it became clear that there was a pattern. Every night at the same time, the lights would flicker and the door handles would jiggle. Claire and Sarah started trying to talk themselves out of it, to ignore it, but there was something about the timing that was unsettling. It was too regular to be a coincidence. At first, they kept it to themselves, not wanting to seem crazy. They had enough on their plates, work, school, just adjusting to life in a new place, and didn't need anyone thinking they were losing their minds. Besides, they didn't want to be the subjects of ridicule, especially from their friends or coworkers. So they kept it quiet, chalking it up to bad wiring, maybe an old heating system that was acting up. But things only got worse. They started getting into trouble at work. Claire would nod off in the middle of meetings, fighting to stay awake, but the exhaustion would catch up with her by the time she made it home. She could never seem to get enough sleep, and when she did manage to fall asleep, the weird sounds would wake her up in the middle of the night. Sarah, too, was having trouble. She would be yawning through her shifts, her energy drained by the constant interruptions. It felt like no matter how much sleep they got, it was never enough. Finally, desperate to get some answers, Claire and Sarah decided to look into the house's history. They did some research and found out that the previous tenant had committed suicide in the house. There were no details, no information on why or how. Just a brief mention in a real estate listing. That was it. Still, something about that stuck with Claire. She didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but it was unsettling to think about. It wasn't long before they both got in touch with a local paranormal investigator. They didn't expect to find anything, really, but they thought they might at least get some peace of mind. The investigator came over and set up cameras, motion sensors, and other equipment. They spent the night monitoring every little detail and came back with their report. But the strange thing was, they didn't find anything unusual. There were no hidden speakers or recordings, no wiring that could explain the lights or the sounds. In fact, the report stated that everything in the house appeared normal, like any other typical old house. No paranormal activity could be detected. But that didn't stop the oddities from continuing. Every night, like clockwork, the lights flickered at 9 p.m., and the door handles jiggled at 3 a.m. It seemed like no matter what they did, the house had its own rhythm, and they were just along for the ride. The tipping point came when Claire's parents came to visit. It had been a while since they'd seen each other, and Claire had been looking forward to spending time with them. They stayed in Claire's room, while Claire slept on the couch downstairs. But the visit quickly turned uncomfortable, especially when her father started ridiculing her for believing in the strange occurrences. He was always the skeptical one, the type of person who needed solid, logical evidence before he would even entertain an idea. He dismissed Claire's experiences as nothing more than stress or imagination running wild. People start making up these stories when they've been under a lot of pressure, he'd say, shaking his head. Claire didn't let it bother her too much. She was used to it, but she wasn't prepared for what happened that night. It was just after 3 a.m., and Claire was lying on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, trying to get some rest. Her parents were upstairs, tucked into bed, and then she heard it, a scratching sound at the window. It was soft at first, like someone gently running their fingernails across the glass. Claire tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a branch brushing against the window. But then it happened again, and again. Her heart began to race. She pulled the blanket up tighter around her, her mind running through every possibility. What if it was someone outside? Or worse, what if it was something? Claire lay there, too scared to move, the scratching growing louder. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt tight. She had no idea what was happening, and the idea of getting up to check made her feel like her legs would give out beneath her. It didn't help that the door to the kitchen was right behind her. She could hear the creaks of the old wooden floorboards every time someone walked around upstairs, and right then, she felt more alone than she ever had before. Upstairs, her mother-in-law had also been woken by a noise. It wasn't the scratching sound, but rather the distinct sound of footsteps coming down the hallway. Soft but deliberate. Claire's mom sat up in bed, unsure at first, but the sound grew louder. It was getting closer to the door, slow but steady. She sat there, heart racing, staring at the doorknob, wondering who it could be. The knob started to turn. At first, her mom thought it was Claire checking in on them, maybe feeling the need to comfort them. But when no one opened the door, she called out, her voice thick with sleep. "Claire, is that you?" There was no answer. Frightened, she called again, but still, there was only silence. She tried to shake off the uneasy feeling settling in her chest, but she couldn't. Something was wrong. Meanwhile, downstairs, Claire was frozen under her blanket. She heard her mother-in-law's voice, but she was too scared to respond. She didn't even want to move. She wanted to yell out, to tell her it was all fine, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. It wasn't just the window noises anymore. It was the footsteps and the turning doorknob. It felt as though something, or someone, was on the other side of that door, waiting for her to react. But what? The rest of the night passed in tense silence. When Claire's parents came down the next morning, they didn't mention anything unusual. Her dad gave her another hard time about the whole haunting thing, but Claire could tell by the way her mom kept glancing at her that something was off. She didn't say anything either, but Claire knew she had heard those footsteps. And she knew she wasn't imagining the jiggling door handle either. After that night, the house felt different. Claire never mentioned it again. She refused to. It terrified her. To this day, she won't talk about what happened that night. She only confided in me once, and that was only because I was laughing at a ghost hunting show on TV. She told me, in a quiet voice, how she felt the chill in the air, how she thought someone was standing next to her, and how she couldn't bring herself to face it. It wasn't until much later that they moved out of that house. The noises, the pressure, the lack of sleep, it all caught up to them. It took a long time for Claire to come to terms with it, and even now, she avoids thinking about it. She doesn't believe in ghosts, but she'll never be able to shake the feeling that something was in that house. Something that made its presence known in the dead of night. And maybe, just maybe, it never really left. I've lived in the same house my whole life. It's an old brick place, nothing too fancy, just 3 bedrooms, a little front porch, and a yard that's gotten smaller over the years as the neighborhood filled in. There's nothing especially strange about the way it looks. No weird towers or creaky gates or anything like that. But weird things have always happened in it, and over time, I've stopped trying to explain them. When I was younger, my mom used to tell us stories about things that happened before I was born. One that stuck with me was about this massive painting we had in the living room back when my older brothers were little. It was of an old sailing ship, big and dramatic, with choppy water and dark clouds behind it. My mom said it was heavy enough that Dad had to use 2 big nails and wire to hang it. She said the frame was thick wood, and the glass in front of the painting wasn't light either. Back then, my brothers were just 4 and 1, still toddlers really, and always getting into trouble together. One afternoon, Mom was in the kitchen when she heard them laughing and shouting from the back bedroom. She figured they were just mucking around and went to tell them to keep it down. She was only gone a few seconds, walked down the short hallway to the bedroom door, but while she was in there telling them to settle down, she heard this loud bang come from the living room. She thought maybe something had fallen off the shelf, or one of the boys had knocked over their toy box earlier, and she hadn't noticed it was unbalanced. But when she went back out, she stopped dead in her tracks. That painting, the one of the ship, was no longer on the wall. It hadn't just fallen straight down either. Somehow, it had flown across the room, past the archway that led to the dining area, and was now leaning upright against the far wall. There was no broken glass. The wire on the back was still intact. The nails were still in the wall. It was like it had been lifted off the hooks, turned in midair, and gently placed against the opposite wall like someone didn't want it damaged. My mom said her skin went cold when she saw it. Not just goosebumps, but the kind of cold that crawls into your bones. She didn't say anything to my brothers. They were too little to understand. But when Dad got home, she told him what happened and demanded he get rid of the painting. He tried to argue at first, said it must have fallen and slid, but she wouldn't budge. Eventually, he took it down to the local op shop the next day, and we never saw it again. That was the first time she told me something had happened in the house that she couldn't explain. At the time, I was just a kid, and it didn't really hit me how weird it was until I got older and started noticing things myself. The weirdest period for me personally started when I was about 15. That was the year my great-grandmother passed away. I didn't know her all that well. We saw her mostly at family gatherings, and by the time I was a teenager, she was already in a nursing home and barely recognized anyone. Still, her death hit my mom hard. They were close when Mom was young, and I think it stirred up a lot of old memories for her. Maybe that's why things started happening again. At first, it was just little things. The computer would turn itself on in the middle of the night. We had this old desktop with a big clunky tower that sat under the desk and made this loud humming sound when it powered up. I remember one night I was in bed, just drifting off, and I heard the familiar whir and beep from the living room. I got up to check, thinking maybe someone had forgotten to shut it down, but the mouse hadn't been moved, and the chair was still tucked in neatly. The weirdest part was that it happened again and again after that. Sometimes I'd be sitting right in front of it, and it would just blink to life without anyone touching anything. Then came the more physical stuff. One night, I was lying in bed on my side, trying to fall asleep. It was a hot night, and I'd pushed the covers down around my legs. I was half asleep when I felt something slide in behind me, like someone getting into bed. Not a full body, just an arm, wrapping around my waist from behind. It wasn't heavy, and it wasn't threatening exactly, but it was definitely there. I was so sure someone was there that I froze completely. I didn't turn around, didn't move. I just lay there, wide awake, heart thudding in my chest, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. Eventually, the feeling faded. Not suddenly, like a hand pulling away, but slowly, like the pressure was easing off. I lay there for what felt like an hour before I finally sat up and turned on the light. There was no one in the room. My door was still shut. Nothing was out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like the air was thicker than normal, like the whole room was holding its breath. Around the same time, my eldest brother started having problems too. He was a few years older than me and had already moved into the converted garage space we used as a second bedroom. One morning, he came into the kitchen looking pale and shaken. He didn't say much, just poured himself a coffee with shaking hands. Later, Mom told me he'd woken up in the middle of the night to feel the sheets being pulled up over his head. At first, he thought it was just a dream, but then it happened again. The sheets would move on their own, gently, not in a rush, like someone was tucking him in. He even tried sleeping with his arms out to catch them in the act, but nothing ever showed up. Just the feeling of the blanket being lifted and drawn up. Things weren't just happening at home either. My dad worked at a little convenience store down the road. He used to take the night shifts, and sometimes I'd walk over and hang around for a bit if I couldn't sleep. He started telling us these weird stories, like how the slushy lids in the drink section would flick out of the holders all on their own. Not fall, not slide, flick, like someone had snapped them with their finger. He'd be stocking shelves or mopping up and would hear the sound, go over, and find the lids scattered across the floor. Another time, he was outside having a smoke break when his car, parked right in front of the store, flashed its headlights twice. He thought someone might be trying to break in, but when he checked, the doors were still locked and there was no one around. Then the automatic doors to the shop opened on their own. They were the kind that only triggered when someone stepped on the mat or passed by, but there was no one there. No wind, no animal, nothing. He stood there just staring at them as they opened, paused, and closed again. We used to joke that maybe my great-grandmother hadn't gone as far as we thought. That maybe she was hanging around, poking at things, making sure we didn't forget her. But there were times it didn't feel funny at all. It felt heavy, like something unseen had settled over the house and the people in it. Things eventually calmed down, at least for a while. The computer stopped turning on by itself, and the bed incidents faded away. Dad chalked the store stuff up to faulty sensors. But every now and then, something small would happen that reminded us those weird months weren't just in our heads. Years later, after we'd all gotten older and started doing our own things, my eldest brother moved back in with his fiancée. They were saving up for their own place and needed somewhere cheap to stay for a few months. Mom let them have the garage room again, and for the first few weeks, everything was fine. Then one night, his fiancée, who's always been kind of into crystals and spirits and that sort of stuff, had an experience she still talks about. She said she was lying in bed, half asleep, when the air in the room seemed to shift. Not like a breeze, but like the pressure dropped. She said it got colder suddenly, and the corner of the room near the closet seemed different, like something was opening there. She described it like a vortex, like the air was pulling inward toward a single point. Then she saw a woman. Long black hair, Pale skin, no sound, no expression, just appearing out of that space like she'd been pulled through a tunnel. The woman didn't float or vanish. She walked, slowly, deliberately, around the edge of the bed. My brother was asleep beside her, completely unaware. The woman moved calmly, never looking at her, never making a sound, and then she was gone, just faded out by the doorway. My brother's fiancée didn't sleep at all that night. She told my mom about it the next morning and wouldn't stay in that room alone after that. We never found any logical explanation for any of it. We tried, believe me. We looked into electrical issues, thought maybe it was the old wiring causing weird effects. We checked for drafts and faulty door sensors, even had someone come look at the foundation to make sure there weren't any subtle shifts causing the thumps and bangs. But nothing ever came of it. The house was structurally sound. No rodents, no faulty sensors, no explanations. Over the years, I've wondered if it was all just coincidence. Maybe we were all under stress, or maybe the brain finds patterns in things that aren't really there. Maybe we saw what we expected to see. But that doesn't explain the painting. That doesn't explain the feeling of an arm wrapped around me, or the computer turning on while I was looking straight at it, with no one else around. We still live here. Mom talks about moving sometimes, but I think deep down, she doesn't really want to leave. This house holds all our memories, good and bad. Whatever weird things have happened, they've always felt connected. Not evil, not dangerous, just strange. Like someone is still here, walking alongside us, quietly making their presence known in little ways. Nothing dramatic has happened in a long time now. The house is quieter, or maybe we've just stopped paying attention to the little things. But every once in a while, when I hear a creak in the hallway or the lights flicker for no reason, I remember. I remember that painting and how it landed gently against the wall without a scratch. I remember the feeling of that arm, warm and definite, curled around my waist. I remember my dad's headlights blinking in an empty lot and the store doors opening to no one. We never saw anything that couldn't have happened in the real world. No ghosts, no voices, no floating objects or spinning heads. Just strange moments, tiny fragments that didn't make sense, but when I was only 2 years old, my mom and I lived in a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was one of those older buildings, 3 floors high, plain concrete walls, the kind that stayed warm in the summer and cold in the winter, no matter how much you tried to change it. Our unit was on the 2nd floor, with a small balcony that looked out over the narrow street below. The neighborhood was close-knit, where most people knew each other and said hello when passing by. Next door to us lived a man who was very kind to everyone in the building. He lived with his wife and 2 daughters. I don't remember much about the layout of their apartment, but I remember the man, at least in the way a toddler remembers people. His face was always smiling. He worked at the airport, which, to my child's mind, made him seem important. He wore a uniform sometimes, or maybe I just imagined one because I knew he went to the airport. He was always gentle, always warm. He had a way of making children laugh, without needing to try too hard. I was just a little kid, barely able to form full sentences, but I loved when he made funny faces or lifted me up like I was weightless. His daughters were older than me, probably about 10 or 12 at the time. They were always polite and gentle around me. Maybe it was because their dad loved kids, and they learned from him. Sometimes they'd sit with me and play simple games. I'd always giggle when I saw them, because it meant their dad might be nearby too. One day, everything changed. I don't remember the details, of course. I was too young to process it then, but my mom told me the story years later, during a family gathering, when I was a teenager. She said the man had died in a car accident on his way home from work. It was sudden, unexpected. He had been on his way back after his shift, maybe tired, maybe just driving normally, when the accident happened. No one knew how exactly, only that he didn't make it. The entire building was shocked. People cried, helped his wife, brought meals to the door, spoke in hushed tones in the hallway. For days afterward, the hallway outside our apartment was unusually quiet. His daughters stopped playing outside. His wife barely opened the door. My mom would visit and help with chores, bring over soup or groceries, trying to ease the heavy silence that had settled in. I didn't understand. I was just 2, still running around with toys in my hands, still pointing at things and asking questions. I noticed that the man was gone. I noticed that I hadn't seen his funny faces in a while. So I asked again and again, "Where is he?" Where did he go? Why isn't he playing with me? My mom and his daughters didn't know how to answer. How do you explain death to a toddler who has no concept of time, no grasp of permanence? They tried to brush it off. He's busy, or he had to go somewhere, but I wasn't convinced. I kept asking, kept pointing to his door whenever we passed it. Maybe I even cried a little, out of confusion more than sadness. And then, a few days later, something happened. It was night. My dad was out of town for work, as he often was, and it was just me and my mom in the apartment. I had a small bed on one side of the room, and my mom had her bed on the other. We shared the bedroom back then, because the apartment was too small for a separate room for me. The walls were off-white, a bit stained in places, with little cracks from the years. The furniture was basic, an old wardrobe, a nightstand, a small desk with a mirror. The floor was wooden, slightly creaky. That night, everything was normal. We brushed our teeth. My mom helped me into my pajamas, and then we climbed into our beds. The light was still on. She always left it on for a while, because I hated the dark. She was just about to turn it off when I did something that chilled her to her bones. I smiled. Not just a casual smile, but a big, happy grin. My eyes weren't looking at her. They were looking just past her, toward the doorway. She followed my gaze, but saw nothing there. Still, my expression didn't change. I looked peaceful, joyful even. My mom said later that it was the kind of smile I used to give when I saw someone I really liked. Her heart must have skipped a beat. She asked me what I was looking at, trying to keep her voice calm. I didn't answer in the playful way I usually did. I just kept smiling, then pointed and said that I saw the man. I said he was right next to the door, smiling at me. My mom froze. The light switch was next to the door. She had been standing there just seconds ago. If there had been anything, or anyone, standing beside her, she hadn't noticed. Her whole body went cold. She didn't turn to look. Instead, she rushed across the room, lifted me out of my bed, and brought me to hers. She pulled the blanket over us both and held me tightly. The light stayed on. She didn't sleep at all that night. She just lay there, holding me, eyes wide open, staring at the door. My mom was only 26 at the time. Still young, still learning how to handle being a parent. That night, she was alone, afraid, and unsure. In Chinese culture, people say that babies and very young children can sometimes see things that adults can't, things that are dirty or not meant to be seen. Ghosts, spirits, leftover emotions, whatever name you give it. And she believed that, or at least respected the old stories enough to feel fear in that moment. The next morning, after she had stayed awake the entire night without blinking, she called someone. She didn't wait for my dad to come back. She contacted a local monk who was known to perform certain spiritual ceremonies. He came over later that day. I don't remember any of it, but my mom told me how he looked around the apartment first, standing silently, nodding at things like he understood something invisible was there. He didn't speak much. Instead, he took a small bag from his coat and began scattering white rice across the doorway. He didn't chant or burn incense. It wasn't some dramatic ceremony with bells and flames. It was quiet, focused, respectful. He told my mother to speak to the air, not loudly, but sincerely, to ask the man to leave the child alone, to explain that I was too young, too unaware, and that it frightened her. She did. She stood near the door, hands shaking, and spoke the words. She wasn't angry. She didn't shout. She just asked politely, tearfully, for him to leave me in peace. She told him that his daughters still needed him, that maybe he could find comfort in watching over them, but that I was too young to understand, and his presence, if it was really there, was scaring her. After that day, nothing happened again. No more strange smiles, no more pointing at invisible things. I went back to being a normal toddler. I played, I laughed, I forgot. As time passed, I stopped asking about the man. Maybe I finally accepted, in the simple way children do, that he wasn't coming back. Or maybe I just got distracted with new toys, new friends, new routines. Life moved on. His daughters grew older. Eventually, his family moved out of the building. We stayed for a few more years before moving too. I never saw them again until much later. When I was 18, I ran into one of the daughters at a local event. She had grown into a beautiful, confident woman. I remembered her face, but only faintly. I didn't bring up the man or what had happened when I was 2. It didn't seem right. She smiled politely, and we exchanged only a few words. There was a quiet weight behind her eyes, but it wasn't my place to ask about it. 15 years after that night, my mom told me the full story. I was old enough to hear it without her worrying about scaring me. She told it calmly, in the middle of a family dinner, while everyone laughed and shared memories. But when she reached the part about me pointing at the door, her voice changed. She grew quiet. She paused more often. I could see her face tighten the way it does when someone remembers something they'd rather not. That night had stayed with her all those years. She had never told anyone outside the family, not even my dad. She hadn't wanted to sound crazy, but she remembered it clearly. Not as a ghost story, not as some superstition, but as a real moment that happened in a quiet apartment, during a lonely night, when her child smiled at something she could not see. The monk had told her something else too. He said I might be more sensitive to things like that it was better for me to avoid places that were known to carry heavy emotions, cemeteries, abandoned buildings, places where people had suffered or died. He didn't make it sound like a curse or a gift. Just a fact, something to keep in mind. She never forgot that advice. I grew up without ever seeing anything like that again. My life was normal. I went to school, made friends, did all the things kids do. I never had any ghostly visions, no strange voices, no unexplained feelings. But after hearing the story, something in me changed. Not fear, exactly, but awareness. I started to pay attention to the way certain places felt. I noticed when a room felt heavy, when the air in a hallway seemed too still. I didn't talk about it. I didn't tell my friends. But I noticed. Looking back, I don't think the man ever meant to scare us. If what I saw that night was real, if it wasn't just a child's imagination, then I think he was just sad. He had left too soon. He had 2 daughters who needed him, a wife who loved him, and a life that wasn't finished. Maybe he came by just to see something innocent again, to see a smiling face. Maybe I reminded him of better days. But life has its rules. The living and the dead don't mix easily. Even the kindest spirit can scare people when they're not ready. And sometimes love has to let go, even when it hurts. After that day, we lived in peace. My mom never saw or felt anything strange again. I grew up healthy and safe. And though I don't remember the man anymore, not his voice, not his smell, not the way he lifted me up, I like to think that, for a little while, I gave him something small and comforting in his final days. A laugh, a smile,